Amy Foster, The Tragic Love Story of a Castaway by Joseph Conrad. Kennedy is a country doctor and lives in Colebrook on the shores of East Bay. The high ground rising abruptly behind the red roofs of the little town crowds the quaint high street against the wall which defends it from the sea. Beyond the seawall, there curves for miles in a vast and regular sweep the barren beach of shingle, with the village of Brenzett standing out darkly across the water, a spire in a clump of trees, and still further out the perpendicular column of a lighthouse, looking in the distance no bigger than a lead pencil, marks the vanishing point of the land. The country at the back of Brenzett is low and flat, but the bay is fairly well sheltered from the seas, and occasionally a big ship, windbound or through stress of weather, makes use of the anchoring ground 1.5 miles due north from you as you stand at the back door of the Ship Inn in Brenzett. A dilapidated windmill nearby lifting its shattered arms from a mound no loftier than a rubbish heap, and a Martello tower squatting at the water's edge 1/2 mile to the south of the Coast Guard cottages are familiar to the skippers of small craft. These are the official sea marks for the patch of trustworthy bottom represented on the Admiralty charts by an irregular oval of dots enclosing several figures 6, with a tiny anchor engraved among them, and the legend "Mud and Shells" over all. The brow of the upland overtops the square tower of the Colebrook Church. The slope is green and looped by a white road. Ascending along this road, you open a valley broad and shallow, a wide green trough of pastures and hedges merging inland into a vista of purple tints and flowing lines closing the view. In this valley down to Brenzett and Colebrook and up to Darmford, the market town 14 miles away, lies the practice of my friend Kennedy. He had begun life as surgeon in the Navy, and afterwards had been the companion of a famous traveller in the days when there were continents with unexplored interiors. His papers on the fauna and flora made him known to scientific societies, and now he had come to a country practice, from choice. The penetrating power of his mind, acting like a corrosive fluid, had destroyed his ambition, I fancy. His intelligence is of a scientific order, of an investigating habit, and of that unappeasable curiosity which believes that there is a particle of a general truth in every mystery. A good many years ago now, on my return from abroad, he invited me to stay with him. I came readily enough, and as he could not neglect his patients to keep me company, he took me on his rounds, 30 miles or so of an afternoon sometimes. I waited for him on the roads. The horse reached after the leafy twigs, and sitting in the dog-cart, I could hear Kennedy's laugh through the half-open door left open of some cottage. He had a big, hearty laugh that would have fitted a man twice his size, a brisk manner, a bronzed face, and a pair of grey, profoundly attentive eyes. He had the talent of making people talk to him freely, and an inexhaustible patience in listening to their tales. One day, as we trotted out of a large village into a shady bit of road, I saw on our left hand a low, black cottage, with diamond panes in the windows, a creeper on the end wall, a roof of shingle, and some roses climbing on the rickety trellis work of the tiny porch. Kennedy pulled up to a walk. A woman, in full sunlight, was throwing a dripping blanket over a line stretched between 2 old apple trees, and as the bob-tailed, long-necked chestnut, trying to get his head, jerked the left hand, covered by a thick dogskin glove, the doctor raised his voice over the hedge. "How's your child, Amy?" I had the time to see her dull face, red, not with a mantling blush, but as if her flat cheeks had been vigorously slapped, and to take in the squat figure, the scanty, dusty brown hair drawn into a tight knot at the back of the head. She looked quite young. With a distinct catch in her breath, her voice sounded low and timid. "He's well, thank you." We trotted again. "A young patient of yours," I said, and the doctor, flicking the chestnut absently, muttered, "Her husband used to be." "She seems a dull creature," I remarked listlessly. "Precisely," said Kennedy. "She is very passive. It's enough to look at the red hands hanging at the end of those short arms, at those slow, prominent brown eyes, to know the inertness of her mind, an inertness that one would think made it everlastingly safe from all the surprises of imagination. And yet, which of us is safe? At any rate, such as you see her, she had enough imagination to fall in love. She's the daughter of one Isaac Foster, who from a small farmer has sunk into a shepherd, the beginning of his misfortunes dating from his runaway marriage with the cook of his widowed father, a well-to-do, apoplectic grazier who passionately struck his name off his will and had been heard to utter threats against his life. But this old affair, scandalous enough to serve as a motive for a Greek tragedy, arose from the similarity of their characters. There are other tragedies, less scandalous and of a subtler poignancy, arising from irreconcilable differences, and from that fear of the incomprehensible that hangs over all our heads, over all our heads. The tired chestnut dropped into a walk, and the rim of the sun, all red in a speckless sky, touched familiarly the smooth top of a ploughed rise near the road, as I had seen it times innumerable touch the distant horizon of the sea. The uniform brownness of the harrowed field glowed with a rosy tinge, as though the powdered clods had sweated out in minute pearls of blood the toil of uncounted ploughmen. From the edge of a copse, a wagon with 2 horses was rolling gently along the ridge. Raised above our heads upon the skyline, it loomed up against the red sun, triumphantly big, enormous, like a chariot of giants drawn by 2 slow-stepping steeds of legendary proportions. And the clumsy figure of the man plodding at the head of the leading horse projected itself on the background of the infinite with a heroic uncouthness. The end of his carter's whip quivered high up in the blue. Kennedy discoursed. She's the eldest of a large family. At the age of 15, they put her out to service at the New Barns farm. I attended Mrs. Smith, the tenant's wife, and saw that girl there for the first time. Mrs. Smith, a genteel person with a sharp nose, made her put on a black dress every afternoon. I don't know what induced me to notice her at all. There are faces that call your attention by a curious want of definiteness in their whole aspect, as walking in a mist, you peer attentively at a vague shape, which after all may be nothing more curious or strange than a signpost. The only peculiarity I perceived in her was a slight hesitation in her utterance, a sort of preliminary stammer which passes away with the first word. When sharply spoken to, she was apt to lose her head at once, but her heart was of the kindest. She had never been heard to express a dislike for a single human being, and she was tender to every living creature. She was devoted to Mrs. Smith, to Mr. Smith, to their dogs, cats, canaries, and as to Mrs. Smith's grey parrot, its peculiarities exercised upon her a positive fascination. Nevertheless, when that outlandish bird, attacked by the cat, shrieked for help in human accents, she ran out into the yard, stopping her ears, and did not prevent the crime. For Mrs. Smith, this was another evidence of her stupidity. On the other hand, her want of charm, in view of Smith's well-known frivolousness, was a great recommendation. Her short-sighted eyes would swim with pity for a poor mouse in a trap, and she had been seen once by some boys on her knees in the wet grass, helping a toad in difficulties. If it's true, as some German fellow has said, that without phosphorus there is no thought, it is still more true that there is no kindness of heart without a certain amount of imagination. She had some. She had even more than is necessary to understand suffering and to be moved by pity. She fell in love under circumstances that leave no room for doubt in the matter, for you need imagination to form a notion of beauty at all, and still more to discover your ideal in an unfamiliar shape. How this aptitude came to her, what it did feed upon, is an inscrutable mystery. She was born in the village, and had never been further away from it than Colebrook, or perhaps Darnford. She lived for 4 years with the Smiths. New Barns is an isolated farmhouse a mile away from the road, and she was content to look day after day at the same fields, hollows, rises, at the trees and the hedgerows, at the faces of the 4 men about the farm, always the same, day after day, month after month, year after year. She never showed a desire for conversation, and as it seemed to me, she did not know how to smile. Sometimes, of a fine Sunday afternoon, she would put on her best dress, a pair of stout boots, a large grey hat trimmed with a black feather. I've seen her in that finery, seize an absurdly slender parasol, climb over 2 stiles, tramp over 3 fields and along 200 yards of road, never further. There stood Foster's cottage. She would help her mother to give their tea to the younger children, wash up the crockery, kiss the little ones, and go back to the farm. That was all. All the rest, all the change, all the relaxation. She never seemed to wish for anything more. And then she fell in love. She fell in love silently, obstinately, perhaps helplessly. It came slowly, but when it came, it worked like a powerful spell. It was love as the ancients understood it, an irresistible and fateful impulse, a possession. Yes, it was in her to become haunted and possessed by a face, by a presence, fatally, as though she had been a pagan worshipper of form under a joyous sky, and to be awakened at last from that mysterious forgetfulness of self, from that enchantment, from that transport, by a fear resembling the unaccountable terror of a brute. With the sun hanging low on its western limit, the expanse of the grasslands framed in the counterscarps of the rising ground took on a gorgeous and sombre aspect. A sense of penetrating sadness, like that inspired by a grave strain of music, disengaged itself from the silence of the fields. The men we met walked past slow, unsmiling, with downcast eyes, as if the melancholy of an overburdened earth had weighted their feet, bowed their shoulders, borne down their glances. "Yes," said the doctor to my remark, "one would think the earth is under a curse, since of all her children, these that cling to her the closest are uncouth in body and as leaden of gait, as if their very hearts were loaded with chains. But here on this same road, you might have seen amongst these heavy men a being lithe, supple, and long-limbed, straight like a pine, with something striving upwards in his appearance, as though the heart within him had been buoyant. Perhaps it was only the force of the contrast, but when he was passing one of these villages here, the soles of his feet did not seem to me to touch the dust of the road. He vaulted over the stiles, paced these slopes with a long elastic stride that made him noticeable at a great distance, and had lustrous black eyes. He was so different from the mankind around that with his freedom of movement, his soft, a little startled, glance, his olive complexion and graceful bearing, his humanity suggested to me the nature of a woodland creature. He came from there. The doctor pointed with his whip, and from the summit of the descent seen over the rolling tops of the trees in a park by the side of the road appeared the level sea far below us, like the floor of an immense edifice, inlaid with bands of dark ripple, with still trails of glitter, ending in a belt of glassy water at the foot of the sky. The light blur of smoke from an invisible steamer faded on the great clearness of the horizon like the mist of a breath on a mirror, and, inshore, the white sails of a coaster, with the appearance of disentangling themselves slowly from under the branches, floated clear of the foliage of the trees. "Shipwrecked in the bay," I said. "Yes, he was a castaway. A poor emigrant from Central Europe bound to America and washed ashore here in a storm, and for him, who knew nothing of the earth, England was an undiscovered country. It was some time before he learned its name, and for all I know, he might have expected to find wild beasts or wild men here, when crawling in the dark over the sea-wall, he rolled down the other side into a dike, where it was another miracle he didn't get drowned. But he struggled instinctively like an animal under a net, and this blind struggle threw him out into a field. He must have been indeed of a tougher fibre than he looked to withstand without expiring such buffetings, the violence of his exertions, and so much fear. Later on, in his broken English that resembled curiously the speech of a young child, he told me himself that he put his trust in God, believing he was no longer in this world. And truly, he would add, how was he to know? He fought his way against the rain and the gale on all fours, and crawled at last among some sheep huddled close under the lee of a hedge. They ran off in all directions, bleating in the darkness, and he welcomed the first familiar sound he heard on these shores. It must have been 2 in the morning then, and this is all we know of the manner of his landing, though he did not arrive unattended by any means. Only his grisly company did not begin to come ashore till much later in the day. The doctor gathered the reins, clicked his tongue. We trotted down the hill. Then, turning, almost directly, a sharp corner into the high street, we rattled over the stones and were home. Late in the evening, Kennedy, breaking a spell of moodiness that had come over him, returned to the story. Smoking his pipe, he paced the long room from end to end. A reading lamp concentrated all its light upon the papers on his desk, and sitting by the open window, I saw, after the windless, scorching day, the frigid splendor of a hazy sea lying motionless under the moon. Not a whisper, not a splash, not a stir of the shingle, not a footstep, not a sigh came up from the earth below, never a sign of life, but the scent of climbing jasmine. And Kennedy's voice, speaking behind me, passed through the wide casement to vanish outside in a chill and sumptuous stillness. The relations of shipwrecks in the olden time tell us of much suffering. Often the castaways were only saved from drowning to die miserably from starvation on a barren coast. Others suffered violent death or else slavery, passing through years of precarious existence with people to whom their strangeness was an object of suspicion, dislike, or fear. We read about these things, and they are very pitiful. It is indeed hard upon a man to find himself a lost stranger, helpless, incomprehensible, and of a mysterious origin in some obscure corner of the earth. Yet amongst all the adventurers shipwrecked in all the wild parts of the world, there is not one, it seems to me, that ever had to suffer a fate so simply tragic as the man I am speaking of, the most innocent of adventurers cast out by the sea in the bight of this bay, almost within sight from this very window. He did not know the name of his ship. Indeed, in the course of time, we discovered he did not even know that ships had names, like Christian people. And when, one day, from the top of the Talford Hill, he beheld the sea lying open to his view, his eyes roamed afar, lost in an air of wild surprise, as though he had never seen such a sight before. And probably he had not. As far as I could make out, he had been hustled together with many others on board an emigrant ship lying at the mouth of the Elbe, too bewildered to take note of his surroundings, too weary to see anything, too anxious to care. They were driven below into the 'tween deck and battened down from the very start. It was a low timber dwelling, he would say, with wooden beams overhead, like the houses in his country, but you went into it down a ladder. It was very large, very cold, damp and sombre, with places in the manner of wooden boxes where people had to sleep, one above another, and it kept on rocking all ways at once, all the time. He crept into one of these boxes and laid down there in the clothes in which he had left his home many days before, keeping his bundle and his stick by his side. People groaned, children cried, water dripped, the lights went out, the walls of the place creaked, and everything was being shaken so that in one's little box one dared not lift one's head. He had lost touch with his only companion, a young man from the same valley, he said, and all the time a great noise of wind went on outside, and heavy blows fell. Boom! Boom! An awful sickness overcame him, even to the point of making him neglect his prayers. Besides, one could not tell whether it was morning or evening. It seemed always to be night in that place. Before that, he had been travelling a long, long time on the iron track. He looked out of the window, which had a wonderfully clear glass in it, and the trees, the houses, the fields, and the long roads seemed to fly round and round about him, till his head swam. He gave me to understand that he had on his passage beheld uncounted multitudes of people, whole nations, all dressed in such clothes as the rich wear. Once he was made to get out of the carriage and slept through a night on a bench in a house of bricks with his bundle under his head. and once for many hours he had to sit on a floor of flat stones dozing, with his knees up and with his bundle between his feet. There was a roof over him which seemed made of glass and was so high that the tallest mountain pine he had ever seen would have had room to grow under it. Steam machines rolled in at one end and out at the other. People swarmed more than you can see on a feast day round the miraculous holy image in the yard of the Carmelite convent down in the plains, where before he left his home he drove his mother in a wooden cart, a pious old woman who wanted to offer prayers and make a vow for his safety. He could not give me an idea of how large and lofty and full of noise and smoke and gloom and clang of iron the place was, but someone had told him it was called Berlin. Then they rang a bell, and another steam machine came in, and again he was taken on and on through a land that wearied his eyes by its flatness, without a single bit of a hill to be seen anywhere. One more night he spent shut up in a building like a good stable with a litter of straw on the floor, guarding his bundle amongst a lot of men, of whom not one could understand a single word he said. In the morning they were all led down to the stony shores of an extremely broad, muddy river, flowing not between hills but between houses that seemed immense. There was a steam machine that went on the water, and they all stood upon it packed tight, only now there were with them many women and children who made much noise. A cold rain fell, the wind blew in his face. He was wet through, and his teeth chattered. He and the young man from the same valley took each other by the hand. They thought they were being taken to America straight away, but suddenly the steam machine bumped against the side of a thing like a house on the water. The walls were smooth and black, and there uprose, growing from the roof as it were, bare trees in the shape of crosses extremely high. That's how it appeared to him then, for he had never seen a ship before. This was the ship that was going to swim all the way to America. Voices shouted, everything swayed. There was a ladder dipping up and down. He went up on his hands and knees in mortal fear of falling into the water below, which made a great splashing. He got separated from his companion, and when he descended into the bottom of that ship, his heart seemed to melt suddenly within him. It was then also, as he told me, that he lost contact for good, and all with one of those 3 men who the summer before had been going about through all the little towns in the foothills of his country. They would arrive on market days driving in a peasant's cart, and would set up an office in an inn or some other Jew's house. There were 3 of them, of whom one with a long beard looked venerable, and they had red cloth collars round their necks and gold lace on their sleeves like government officials. They sat proudly behind a long table, and in the next room, so that the common people shouldn't hear, they kept a cunning telegraph machine through which they could talk to the Emperor of America. The fathers hung about the door, but the young men of the mountains would crowd up to the table asking many questions, for there was work to be got all the year round at $3 a day in America, and no military service to do. But the American Kaiser would not take everybody. Oh no, he himself had a great difficulty in getting accepted, and the venerable man in uniform had to go out of the room several times to work the telegraph on his behalf. The American Kaiser engaged him at last at $3, he being young and strong. However, many able young men backed out, afraid of the great distance. Besides, those only who had some money could be taken. There were some who sold their huts and their land because it cost a lot of money to get to America. But then, once there, you had $3 a day, and if you were clever, you could find places where true gold could be picked up on the ground. His father's house was getting over full. 2 of his brothers were married and had children. He promised to send money home from America by post twice a year. His father sold an old cow, a pair of piebald mountain ponies of his own raising, and a cleared plot of fair pasture land on the sunny slope of a pine-clad pass to a Jew innkeeper in order to pay the people of the ship that took men to America to get rich in a short time. He must have been a real adventurer at heart, for how many of the greatest enterprises in the conquest of the earth had for their beginning just such a bargaining away of the paternal cow for the mirage or true gold far away? I've been telling you more or less in my own words what I learned fragmentarily in the course of 2 or 3 years, during which I seldom missed an opportunity of a friendly chat with him. He told me this story of his adventure with many flashes of white teeth and lively glances of black eyes, at first in a sort of anxious baby talk, then, as he acquired the language, with great fluency, but always with that singing, soft, and at the same time vibrating intonation that instilled a strangely penetrating power into the sound of the most familiar English words, as if they had been the words of an unearthly language. And he always would come to an end, with many emphatic shakes of his head, upon that awful sensation of his heart melting within him. Directly he set foot on board that ship. Afterwards there seemed to come for him a period of blank ignorance, at any rate as to facts. No doubt he must have been abominably seasick and abominably unhappy, this soft and passionate adventurer, taken thus out of his knowledge, and feeling bitterly as he lay in his emigrant bunk his utter loneliness. For his was a highly sensitive nature. The next thing we know of him for certain is that he had been hiding in Hammond's pig pound by the side of the road to Norton 6 miles, as the crow flies from the sea. Of these experiences he was unwilling to speak. They seemed to have seared into his soul a sombre sort of wonder and indignation. Through the rumours of the countryside, which lasted for a good many days after his arrival, we know that the fishermen of West Colebrook had been disturbed and startled by heavy knocks against the walls of weatherboard cottages and by a voice crying piercingly strange words in the night. Several of them turned out even, but no doubt he had fled in sudden alarm at their rough, angry tones, hailing each other in the darkness. A sort of frenzy must have helped him up the steep Norton Hill. It was he, no doubt, who early the following morning had been seen lying, in a swoon, I should say, on the roadside grass by the Brenzett carrier, who actually got down to have a nearer look, but drew back, intimidated by the perfect immobility, and by something queer in the aspect of that tramp, sleeping so still under the showers. As the day advanced, some children came dashing into school at Norton in such a fright that the schoolmistress went out and spoke indignantly to a horrid-looking man on the road. He edged away, hanging his head for a few steps, and then suddenly ran off with extraordinary fleetness. The driver of Mr. Bradley's milk cart made no secret of it that he had lashed with his whip at a hairy sort of gypsy fellow who, jumping up at a turn of the road by the vents, made a snatch at the pony's bridle. And he caught him a good one too, right over the face, he said, that made him drop down in the mud a jolly sight quicker than he had jumped up, but it was a good half a mile before he could stop the pony. Maybe that in his desperate endeavours to get help, and in his need to get in touch with someone, the poor devil had tried to stop the cart. Also, 3 boys confessed afterwards to throwing stones at a funny tramp, knocking about all wet and muddy, and, it seemed, very drunk, in the narrow, deep lane by the lime kilns. All this was the talk of 3 villages for days, but we have Mrs. Finn's, the wife of Smith's waggoner, unimpeachable testimony that she saw him get over the low wall of Hammond's pig pound and lurch straight at her, babbling aloud in a voice that was enough to make one die of fright. Having the baby with her in a perambulator, Mrs. Finn called out to him to go away, and as he persisted in coming nearer, she hit him courageously with her umbrella over the head, and without once looking back, ran like the wind with the perambulator as far as the first house in the village. She stopped then, out of breath, and spoke to old Lewis, hammering there at a heap of stones, and the older chap, taking off his immense black wire goggles, got up on his shaky legs to look where she pointed. Together they followed with their eyes the figure of the man running over a field. They saw him fall down, pick himself up, and run on again, staggering and waving his long arms above his head in the direction of the New Barnes farm. From that moment he is plainly in the toils of his obscure and touching destiny. There is no doubt after this of what happened to him. All is certain now: Mrs. Smith's intense terror, Amy Foster's stolid conviction held against the other's nervous attack that the man meant no harm. Smith's exasperation, on his return from Darmford Market, at finding the dog barking himself into a fit, the back door locked, his wife in hysterics, and all for an unfortunate dirty tramp supposed to be even then lurking in his stackyard. Was he? He would teach him to frighten women. Smith is notoriously hot-tempered, but the sight of some nondescript and miry creature sitting cross-legged amongst a lot of loose straw and swinging itself to and fro like a bear in a cage made him pause. Then this tramp stood up silently before him, one mass of mud and filth from head to foot. Smith, alone amongst his stacks with this apparition, in the stormy twilight ringing with the infuriated barking of the dog, felt the dread of an inexplicable strangeness. But when that being, parting with his black hands the long matted locks that hung before his face as you part the two halves of a curtain, looked out at him with glistening, wild, black and white eyes, the weirdness of this silent encounter fairly staggered him. He had admitted since, for the story has been a legitimate subject of conversation about here for years, that he made more than one step backwards. Then a sudden burst of rapid, senseless speech persuaded him at once that he had to do with an escaped lunatic. In fact, that impression never wore off completely. Smith has not in his heart given up his secret conviction of the man's essential insanity to this very day. As the creature approached him, jabbering in a most discomposing manner, Smith, unaware that he was being addressed as gracious lord and adjured in God's name to afford food and shelter, kept on speaking firmly but gently to it, and retreating all the time into the other yard. At last, watching his chance, by a sudden charge, he bundled him headlong into the wood lodge, and instantly shot the bolt. Thereupon he wiped his brow, though the day was cold. He had done his duty to the community by shutting up a wandering and probably dangerous maniac. Smith isn't a hard man at all, but he had room in his brain only for that one idea of lunacy. He was not imaginative enough to ask himself whether the man might not be perishing with cold and hunger. Meantime, at first, the maniac made a great deal of noise in the lodge. Mrs. Smith was screaming upstairs, where she had locked herself in her bedroom, but Amy Foster sobbed piteously at the kitchen door, wringing her hands and muttering, "Don't! Don't!" I dare say Smith had a rough time of it that evening with one noise and another, and this insane, disturbing voice crying obstinately through the door only added to his irritation. He couldn't possibly have connected this troublesome lunatic with the sinking of a ship in East Bay, of which there had been a rumour in the Darmford marketplace. And I dare say the man inside had been very near to insanity on that night. Before his excitement collapsed and he became unconscious, he was throwing himself violently about in the dark, rolling on some dirty sacks and biting his fists with rage, cold, hunger, amazement, and despair. He was a mountaineer of the eastern range of the Carpathians, and the vessel sunk the night before in East Bay was the Hamburg emigrant ship Herzogin Sophia Dorothea, of appalling memory. A few months later, we could read in the papers the accounts of the bogus emigration agencies among the Sclavonian peasantry in the more remote provinces of Austria. The object of these scoundrels was to get hold of the poor, ignorant people's homesteads, and they were in league with the local usurers. They exported their victims through Hamburg mostly. As to the ship, I had watched her out of this very window, reaching close-hauled under short canvas into the bay on a dark, threatening afternoon. She came to an anchor, correctly by the chart, off the Brenzett Coast Guard station. I remember before the night fell looking out again at the outlines of her spars and rigging that stood out dark and pointed on a background of ragged slaty clouds like another and a slighter spire to the left of the Brenzett church tower. In the evening, the wind rose. At midnight, I could hear in my bed the terrific gusts and the sounds of a driving deluge. About that time, the Coast Guardmen thought they saw the lights of a steamer over the anchoring ground. In a moment, they vanished, but it is clear that another vessel of some sort had tried for shelter in the bay on that awful blind night, had rammed the German ship amidships, a breach, as one of the divers told me afterwards, that you could sail a Thames barge through, and then had gone out either scathless or damaged, who shall say, but had gone out, unknown, unseen, and fatal, to perish mysteriously at sea. Of her nothing ever came to light, and yet the hue and cry that was raised all over the world would have found her out if she had been in existence anywhere on the face of the waters. A completeness without a clue, and a stealthy silence as of a neatly executed crime, characterized this murderous disaster, which, as you may remember, had its gruesome celebrity. The wind would have prevented the loudest outcries from reaching the shore. There had been evidently no time for signals of distress. It was death without any sort of fuss. The Hamburg ship, filling all at once, capsized as she sank, and at daylight there was not even the end of a spar to be seen above water. She was missed, of course, and at first the coastguardman surmised that she had either dragged her anchor or parted her cable sometime during the night, and had been blown out to sea. Then, after the tide turned, the wreck must have shifted a little and released some of the bodies, because a child, a little fair-haired child in a red frock, came ashore abreast of the Martello Tower. By the afternoon you could see along 3 miles of beach dark figures with bare legs dashing in and out of the tumbling foam, and rough-looking men, women with hard faces. Children, mostly fair-haired, were being carried, stiff and dripping, on stretchers, on wattles, on ladders, in a long procession past the door of the Ship Inn, to be laid out in a row under the north wall of the Brenzett Church. Officially, the body of the little girl in the red frock is the first thing that came ashore from that ship. But I have patients amongst the seafaring population of West Colebrook, and unofficially I am informed that very early that morning 2 brothers, who went down to look after their cobble hauled up on the beach, found, a good way from Brenzett, an ordinary ship's hen coop lying high and dry on the shore, with 11 drowned ducks inside. Their families ate the birds, and the hen coop was split into firewood with a hatchet. It is possible that a man, supposing he happened to be on deck at the time of the accident, might have floated ashore on that hen coop. He might. I admit it is improbable, but there was the man, and for days, nay, for weeks, it didn't enter our heads that we had amongst us the only living soul that had escaped from that disaster. The man himself, even when he learned to speak intelligibly, could tell us very little. He remembered he had felt better after the ship had anchored, I suppose, and that the darkness, the wind, and the rain took his breath away. This looks as if he had been on deck some time during that night, but we mustn't forget he had been taken out of his knowledge, that he had been seasick and battened down below for 4 days, that he had no general notion of a ship or of the sea, and therefore could have no definite idea of what was happening to him. The rain, the wind, the darkness he knew. He understood the bleating of the sheep, and he remembered the pain of his wretchedness and misery, his heartbroken astonishment that it was neither seen nor understood, his dismay at finding all the men angry and all the women fierce. He had approached them as a beggar, it is true, he said, but in his country, even if they gave nothing, they spoke gently to beggars. The children in his country were not taught to throw stones at those who asked for compassion. Smith's strategy overcame him completely. The wood lodge presented the horrible aspect of a dungeon. What would be done to him next? No wonder that Amy Foster appeared to his eyes with the aureole of an angel of light. The girl had not been able to sleep for thinking of the poor man, and in the morning, before the Smiths were up, she slipped out across the backyard. Holding the door of the wood lodge ajar, she looked in and extended to him half a loaf of white bread. "Such bread as the rich eat in my country," he used to say. At this, he got up slowly from amongst all sorts of rubbish, stiff, hungry, trembling, miserable, and doubtful. "Can you eat this?" she asked in her soft and timid voice. He must have taken her for a gracious lady. He devoured ferociously, and tears were falling on the crust. Suddenly, he dropped the bread, seized her wrist, and imprinted a kiss on her hand. She was not frightened. Through his forlorn condition, she had observed that he was good-looking. She shut the door and walked back slowly to the kitchen. Much later on, she told Mrs. Smith, who shuddered at the bare idea of being touched by that creature. Through this act of impulsive pity, he was brought back again within the pale of human relations with his new surroundings. He never forgot it. Never. That very same morning, old Mr. Swaffer, Smith's nearest neighbour, came over to give his advice and ended by carrying him off. He stood, unsteady on his legs, meek and caked over in half-dried mud, while the two men talked around him in an incomprehensible tongue. Mrs. Smith had refused to come downstairs till the madman was off the premises. Amy Foster, far from within the dark kitchen, watched through the open back door, and he obeyed the signs that were made to him to the best of his ability. But Smith was full of mistrust. "Mind, sir, it may be all his cunning," he cried repeatedly in a tone of warning. When Mr. Swaffer started the mare, the deplorable being sitting humbly by his side, through weakness, nearly fell out over the back of the high two-wheeled cart. Swaffer took him straight home, and it is then that I come upon the scene. I was called in by the simple process of the old man beckoning to me with his forefinger over the gate of his house as I happened to be driving past. I got down, of course. "I've got something here," he mumbled, leading the way to an outhouse at a little distance from his other farm buildings. It was there that I saw him first, in a long, low room taken upon the space of that sort of coach-house. It was bare and whitewashed, with a small square aperture glazed with one cracked, dusty pane at its further end. He was lying on his back upon a straw pallet. They had given him a couple of horse blankets, and he seemed to have spent the remainder of his strength in the exertion of cleaning himself. He was almost speechless, his quick breathing under the blankets pulled up to his chin. His glittering, restless black eyes reminded me of a wild bird caught in a snare. While I was examining him, old Swaffer stood silently by the door, passing the tips of his fingers along his shaven upper lip. I gave some directions, promised to send a bottle of medicine, and naturally made some inquiries. "Smith caught him in the stackyard at New Barnes," said the old chap in his deliberate, unmoved manner, and as if the other had been indeed a sort of wild animal. "That's how I came by him. Quite a curiosity, isn't he? Now tell me, Doctor, you've been all over the world. Don't you think that's a bit of a Hindu we've got hold of here?" I was greatly surprised. His long black hair, scattered over the straw bolster, contrasted with the olive pallor of his face. It occurred to me he might be a Basque. It didn't necessarily follow that he should understand Spanish, but I tried him with the few words I know, and also with some French. The whispered sounds I caught by bending my ear to his lips puzzled me utterly. That afternoon, the young ladies from the rectory, one of them read Goethe with a dictionary, and the other had struggled with Dante for years, coming to see Miss Swaffer, tried their German and Italian on him from the doorway. They retreated, just the least bit scared by the flood of passionate speech which, turning on his palate, he let out at them. They admitted that the sound was pleasant, soft, musical, but in conjunction with his looks, perhaps, it was startling, so excitable, so utterly unlike anything one had ever heard. The village boys climbed up the bank to have a peep through the little square aperture. Everybody was wondering what Mr. Swaffer would do with him. He simply kept him. Swaffer would be called eccentric were he not so much respected. They will tell you that Mr. Swaffer sits up as late as 10 o'clock at night to read books, and they will tell you also that he can write a cheque for £200 without thinking twice about it. He himself would tell you that the Swaffers had owned land between this and Darmford for these 300 years. He must be 85 today, but he does not look a bit older than when I first came here. He is a great breeder of sheep and deals extensively in cattle. He attends market days for miles around in every sort of weather, and drives sitting bowed low over the reins, his lank grey hair curling over the collar of his warm coat and with a green plaid rug round his legs. The calmness of advanced age gives a solemnity to his manner. He is clean-shaved, his lips are thin and sensitive. Something rigid and monocle in the set of his features lends a certain elevation to the character of his face. He has been known to drive miles in the rain to see a new kind of rose in somebody's garden or a monstrous cabbage grown by a cottager. He loves to hear tell of or to be shown something that he calls outlandish. Perhaps it was just that outlandishness of the man which influenced old Swaffer. Perhaps it was only an inexplicable caprice. All I know is that at the end of 3 weeks, I caught sight of Smith's lunatic digging in Swaffer's kitchen garden. They had found out he could use a spade. He dug barefooted. His black hair flowed over his shoulders. I suppose it was Swaffer who had given him the striped old cotton shirt, but he wore still the national brown cloth trousers, in which he had been washed ashore, fitting to the leg almost like tights, was belted with a broad leathern belt studded with little brass discs, and had never yet ventured into the village. The land he looked upon seemed to him kept neatly, like the grounds round a landowner's house. The size of the cart horses struck him with astonishment. The roads resembled garden walks, and the aspect of the people, especially on Sundays, spoke of opulence. He wondered what made them so hard-hearted and their children so bold. He got his food at the back door, carried it in both hands carefully to his outhouse, and sitting alone on his pallet, would make the sign of the cross before he began. Beside the same pallet, kneeling in the early darkness of the short days, he recited aloud the Lord's Prayer before he slept. Whenever he saw old Swaffer, he would bow with veneration from the waist and stand erect while the old man, with his fingers over his upper lip, surveyed him silently. He bowed also to Miss Swaffer, who kept house frugally for her father, a broad-shouldered, big-boned woman of 45, with the pocket of her dress full of keys and a grey, steady eye. She was church, as people said, while her father was one of the trustees of the Baptist chapel, and wore a little steel cross at her waist. She dressed severely in black, in memory of one of the innumerable Bradleys of the neighbourhood, to whom she had been engaged some 25 years ago, a young farmer who broke his neck out hunting on the eve of the wedding day. She had the unmoved countenance of the deaf, spoke very seldom, and her lips, thin like her father's, astonished one sometimes by a mysteriously ironic curl. These were the people to whom he owed allegiance, and an overwhelming loneliness seemed to fall from the leaden sky of that winter without sunshine. All the faces were sad. He could talk to no one, and had no hope of ever understanding anybody. It was as if these had been the faces of people from the other world, dead people, he used to tell me years afterwards. Upon my word, I wonder he did not go mad. He didn't know where he was, somewhere very far from his mountains, somewhere over the water. Was this America? He wondered. If it hadn't been for the steel cross at Miss Swaffer's belt, he would not, he confessed, have known whether he was in a Christian country at all. He used to cast stealthy glances at it and feel comforted. There was nothing here the same as in his country. The earth and the water were different. There were no images of the Redeemer by the roadside. The very grass was different, and the trees. All the trees but the 3 old Norway pines on the bit of lawn before Swaffer's house, and these reminded him of his country. He had been detected once, after dusk, with his forehead against the trunk of one of them, sobbing and talking to himself. They had been like brothers to him at that time, he affirmed. Everything else was strange. Conceive you the kind of an existence overshadowed, oppressed by the everyday material appearances, as if by the visions of a nightmare. At night, when he could not sleep, he kept on thinking of the girl who gave him the first piece of bread he had eaten in this foreign land. She had been neither fierce, nor angry, nor frightened. Her face he remembered as the only comprehensible face amongst all these faces that were as closed, as mysterious, and as mute as the faces of the dead, who are possessed of a knowledge beyond the comprehension of the living. I wonder whether the memory of her compassion prevented him from cutting his throat. But there! I suppose I am an old sentimentalist, and forget the instinctive love of life which it takes all the strength of an uncommon despair to overcome. He did the work which was given him with an intelligence which surprised old Swaffer. By and by it was discovered that he could help at the ploughing, could milk the cows, feed the bullocks in the cattle yard, and was of some use with the sheep. He began to pick up words, too, very fast, and suddenly, one fine morning in spring, he rescued from an untimely death a grandchild of old Swaffer. Swaffer's younger daughter is married to Wilcox, a solicitor and the town clerk of Colebrook. Regularly, twice a year, they come to stay with the old man for a few days. Their only child, a little girl not 3 years old at the time, ran out of the house alone in her little white pinafore, and toddling across the grass of a terraced garden, pitched herself over a low wall head first into the horse pond in the yard below. Our man was out with the wagoner and the plough in the field nearest to the house, and as he was leading the team round to begin a fresh furrow, he saw, through the gap of the gate, what for anybody else would have been a mere flutter of something white. But he had straight-glancing, quick, far-reaching eyes that only seemed to flinch and lose their amazing power before the immensity of the sea. He was barefooted, and looking as outlandish as the heart of Swaffer could desire. Leaving the horses on the turn, to the inexpressible disgust of the wagoner he bounded off, going over the ploughed ground in long leaps, and suddenly appeared before the mother, thrust the child into her arms and strode away. The pond was not very deep, but still, if he had not had such good eyes, the child would have perished, miserably suffocated in the foot or so of sticky mud at the bottom. Old Swaffer walked out slowly into the field, waited till the plough came over to his side, had a good look at him, and without saying a word, went back to the house. But from that time they laid out his meals on the kitchen table, and at first Miss Swaffer, all in black and with an inscrutable face, would come and stand in the doorway of the living room to see him make a big sign of the cross before he fell to. I believe that from that day, too, Swaffer began to pay him regular wages. I can't follow step by step his development. He cut his hair short, was seen in the village and along the road going to and fro to his work like any other man. Children ceased to shout after him. He became aware of social differences, but remained for a long time surprised at the bare poverty of the churches among so much wealth. He couldn't understand either why they were kept shut up on weekdays. There was nothing to steal in them. Was it to keep people from praying too often? The rectory took much notice of him about that time, and I believe the young ladies attempted to prepare the ground for his conversion. They could not, however, break him of his habit of crossing himself, but he went so far as to take off the string with a couple of brass medals the size of a sixpence, a tiny metal cross, and a square sort of scapulary which he wore round his neck. He hung them on the wall by the side of his bed, and he was still to be heard every evening reciting the Lord's Prayer in incomprehensible words and in a slow, fervent tone, as he had heard his old father do at the head of all the kneeling family, big and little, on every evening of his life. And though he wore corduroys at work and a slop-made pepper and salt suit on Sundays, strangers would turn round to look after him on the road. His foreignness had a peculiar and indelible stamp. At last, people became used to see him, but they never became used to him. His rapid, skimming walk, his swarthy complexion, his hat cocked on the left ear, his habit, on warm evenings, of wearing his coat over one shoulder like a hussar's dolman, his manner of leaping over the stiles not as a feat of agility, but in the ordinary course of progression. All these peculiarities were, as one may say, so many causes of scorn and offence to the inhabitants of the village. They wouldn't in their dinner hour lie flat on their backs on the grass to stare at the sky. Neither did they go about the fields screaming dismal tunes. Many times have I heard his high-pitched voice from behind the ridge of some sloping sheep-walk, a voice light and soaring like a lark's, but with a melancholy human note, over our fields that hear only the song of birds. And I should be startled myself. Ah! He was different, innocent of heart and full of goodwill, which nobody wanted. This castaway, that like a man transplanted into another planet, was separated by an immense space from his past, and by an immense ignorance from his future. His quick, fervent utterance positively shocked everybody. An excitable devil, they called him. One evening, In the tap room of the Coach and Horses, having drunk some whiskey, he upset them all by singing a love song of his country. They hooted him down, and he was pained, but Preble, the lame wheelwright, and Vincent, the fat blacksmith, and the other notables too, wanted to drink their evening beer in peace. On another occasion, he tried to show them how to dance. The dust rose in clouds from the sanded floor. He leaped straight up amongst the deal tables, struck his heels together, squatted on one heel in front of old Preble, shooting out the other leg, uttered wild and exulting cries, jumped up to whirl on one foot, snapping his fingers above his head. And a strange carter who was having a drink in there began to swear and cleared out with his half-pint in his hand into the bar. But when suddenly he sprang upon a table and continued to dance among the glasses, the landlord interfered. He didn't want any acrobat tricks in the tap-room. They laid their hands on him. Having had a glass or two, Mr. Swaffer's foreigner tried to expostulate, was ejected forcibly, got a black eye. I believe he felt the hostility of his human surroundings, but he was tough in spirit too, as well as in body. Only the memory of the sea frightened him with that vague terror that is left by a bad dream. His home was far away, and he did not want now to go to America. I had often explained to him that there is no place on earth where true gold can be found, lying ready, and to be got for the trouble of the picking up. How then, he asked, could he ever return home with empty hands when there had been sold a cow, 2 ponies, and a bit of land to pay for his going? His eyes would fill with tears, and averting them from the immense shimmer of the sea, he would throw himself face down on the grass. But sometimes, cocking his hat with a little conquering air, he would defy my wisdom. He had found his bit of true gold. That was Amy Foster's heart, which was a golden heart, and soft to people's misery, he would say in the accents of overwhelming conviction. He was called Yanko. He had explained that this meant Little John, but as he would also repeat very often that he was a mountaineer, some words sounding in the dialect of his country like Gurul, he got it for his surname, and this is the only trace of him that the succeeding ages may find in the marriage register of the parish. There it stands, Yanko Gurul, in the rector's handwriting. The crooked cross made by the castaway, a cross whose tracing no doubt seemed to him the most solemn part of the whole ceremony, is all that remains now to perpetuate the memory of his name. His courtship had lasted some time, ever since he got his precarious footing in the community. It began by his buying for Amy Foster a green satin ribbon in Darmford. This was what you did in his country. You bought a ribbon at a Jew's stall on a fair day. I don't suppose the girl knew what to do with it, but he seemed to think that his honourable intentions could not be mistaken. It was only when he declared his purpose to get married that I fully understood how, for 100 futile and inappreciable reasons, how, shall I say, odious, he was to all the countryside. Every old woman in the village was up in arms. Smith, coming upon him near the farm, promised to break his head for him if he found him about again. But he twisted his little black moustache with such a bellicose air and rolled such big, black, fierce eyes at Smith that this promise came to nothing. Smith, however, told the girl that she must be mad to take up with a man who was surely wrong in his head. All the same, when she heard him in the gloaming whistle from beyond the orchard a couple of bars of a weird and mournful tune, she would drop whatever she had in her hand. She would leave Mrs. Smith in the middle of a sentence, and she would run out to his call. Mrs. Smith called her a shameless hussy. She answered nothing. She said nothing at all to anybody, and went on her way as if she had been deaf. She and I alone, all in the land, I fancy, could see his very real beauty. He was very good-looking, and most graceful in his bearing, with that something wild as of a woodland creature in his aspect. Her mother moaned over her dismally whenever the girl came to see her on her day out. The father was surly, but pretended not to know, and Mrs. Finn once told her plainly that, "This man, my dear, will do you some harm some day yet." And so it went on. They could be seen on the roads, she tramping stolidly in her finery, grey dress, black feather, stout boots, prominent white cotton gloves that caught your eye 100 yards away, and he, his coat slung picturesquely over one shoulder, pacing by her side, gallant of bearing and casting tender glances upon the girl with the golden heart. I wonder whether he saw how plain she was. Perhaps among types so different from what he had ever seen, he had not the power to judge, or perhaps he was seduced by the divine quality of her pity. Yanko was in great trouble meantime. In his country, you get an old man for an ambassador in marriage affairs. He did not know how to proceed. However, one day in the midst of sheep in a field, he was now Swaffer's under-shepherd with Foster, he took off his hat to the father and declared himself humbly. "I dare say she's fool enough to marry you," was all Foster said. And then, he used to relate, he puts his hat on his head, looks black at me as if he wanted to cut my throat, whistles the dog, and off he goes, leaving me to do the work. The Fosters, of course, didn't like to lose the wages the girl earned. Amy used to give all her money to her mother, but there was in Foster a very genuine aversion to that match. He contended that the fellow was very good with sheep, but was not fit for any girl to marry. For one thing, he used to go along the hedges muttering to himself like a damn fool. And then, these foreigners behave very queerly to women sometimes, and perhaps he would want to carry her off somewhere or run off himself. It was not safe. He preached it to his daughter that the fellow might ill-use her in some way. She made no answer. It was, they said in the village, as if the man had done something to her. People discussed the matter. It was quite an excitement, and the two went on walking out together in the face of opposition. Then something unexpected happened. I don't know whether old Swaffer ever understood how much he was regarded in the light of a father by his foreign retainer. Anyway, the relation was curiously feudal. So when Yanko asked formally for an interview, and the Miss too, he called the severe, deaf Miss Swaffer simply Miss, it was to obtain their permission to marry. Swaffer heard him unmoved, dismissed him by a nod, and then shouted the intelligence into Miss Swaffer's best ear. She showed no surprise, and only remarked grimly, in a veiled, blank voice, "He certainly won't get any other girl to marry him." It is Miss Swaffer who has all the credit of the munificence, but in a very few days it came out that Mr. Swaffer had presented Yanko with a cottage, the cottage you've seen this morning, and something like an acre of ground, had made it over to him in absolute property. Wilcox expedited the deed, and I remember him telling me he had a great pleasure in making it ready. It recited, "In consideration of saving the life of my beloved grandchild, Bertha Wilcox." Of course, after that, no power on earth could prevent them from getting married. Her infatuation endured. People saw her going out to meet him in the evening. She stared with unblinking, fascinated eyes up the road where he was expected to appear, walking freely, with a swing from the hip, and humming one of the love tunes of his country. When the boy was born, he got elevated at the Coach and Horses, essayed again a song and a dance, and was again ejected. People expressed their commiseration for a woman married to that jack-in-the-box. He didn't care. There was a man now, he told me boastfully, to whom he could sing and talk in the language of his country, and show how to dance by and by. But I don't know. To me he appeared to have grown less springy of step, heavier in body, less keen of eye. Imagination, no doubt, but it seems to me now as if the net of fate had been drawn closer round him already. One day I met him on the footpath over the Talford Hill. He told me that women were funny. I had heard already of domestic differences. People were saying that Amy Foster was beginning to find out what sort of man she had married. He looked upon the sea with indifferent, unseeing eyes. His wife had snatched the child out of his arms one day as he sat on the doorstep, crooning to it a song such as the mothers sing to babies in his mountains. She seemed to think he was doing it some harm. Women are funny. And she had objected to him praying aloud in the evening. Why? He expected the boy to repeat the prayer aloud after him by and by, as he used to do after his old father when he was a child, in his own country, and I discovered he longed for their boy to grow up, so that he could have a man to talk with in that language that to our ears sounded so disturbing, so passionate, and so bizarre. Why his wife should dislike the idea he couldn't tell. But that would pass, he said. And tilting his head knowingly, he tapped his breastbone to indicate that she had a good heart. Not hard, not fierce, open to compassion, charitable to the poor. I walked away thoughtfully. I wondered whether his difference, his strangeness, were not penetrating with repulsion that dull nature they had begun by irresistibly attracting. I wondered. The doctor came to the window and looked out at the frigid splendor of the sea, immense in the haze, as if enclosing all the earth with all the hearts lost among the passions of love and fear. "Physiologically now," he said, turning away abruptly. It was possible. It was possible. He remained silent, then went on. At all events, the next time I saw him, he was ill, lung trouble. He was tough, but I dare say he was not acclimatized as well as I had supposed. It was a bad winter, and of course, these mountaineers do get fits of homesickness, and a state of depression would make him vulnerable. He was lying half-dressed on a couch downstairs. A table covered with a dark oilcloth took up all the middle of the little room. There was a wicker cradle on the floor, a kettle spouting steam on the hob, and some child's linen lay drying on the fender. The room was warm, but the door opens right into the garden, as you noticed, perhaps. He was very feverish and kept on muttering to himself. She sat on a chair and looked at him fixedly across the table with her brown, blurred eyes. "Why don't you have him upstairs?" I asked. With a start and a confused stammer, she said, I couldn't sit with him upstairs, sir." I gave her certain directions, and going outside, I said again that he ought to be in bed upstairs. She wrung her hands. I couldn't. He keeps on saying something, I don't know what." With the memory of all the talk against the man that had been dinned into her ears, I looked at her narrowly. I looked into her short-sighted eyes, at her dumb eyes that once in her life had seen an enticing shape, but seemed, staring at me, to see nothing at all now. But I saw she was uneasy. "What's the matter with him?" she asked in a sort of vacant trepidation. "He doesn't look very ill. I never did see anybody look like this before." "Do you think," I asked indignantly, "he is shamming?" "I can't help it, sir," she said stolidly. And suddenly she clapped her hands and looked right and left. "And there's the baby. I'm so frightened. He wanted me just now to give him the baby. I can't understand what he says to it." "Can't you ask a neighbor to come in tonight?" I asked. "Please, sir, nobody seems to care to come," she muttered, dully resigned all at once. I impressed upon her the necessity of the greatest care, and then had to go. There was a good deal of sickness that winter. "Oh, I hope he won't talk," she exclaimed softly, just as I was going away. I don't know how it is I did not see, but I didn't. And yet, turning in my trap, I saw her lingering before the door, very still, and as if meditating a flight up the miry road. Towards the night, his fever increased. He tossed, moaned, and now and then muttered a complaint, and she sat with the table between her and the couch, watching every movement and every sound, with the terror, the unreasonable terror, of that man she could not understand creeping over her. She had drawn the wicker cradle close to her feet. There was nothing in her now but the maternal instinct and that unaccountable fear. Suddenly coming to himself, parched, he demanded a drink of water. She did not move. She had not understood, though he may have thought he was speaking in English. He waited, looking at her, burning with fever, amazed at her silence and immobility, and then he shouted impatiently, "Water! Give me water!" She jumped to her feet, snatched up the child, and stood still. He spoke to her, and his passionate remonstrances only increased her fear of that strange man. I believe he spoke to her for a long time, entreating, wondering, pleading, ordering, I suppose. She says she bore it as long as she could. And then a gust of rage came over him. He sat up and called out terribly, one word, some word. Then he got up as though he hadn't been ill at all, she says. And as in fevered dismay, indignation, and wonder he tried to get to her round the table, she simply opened the door and ran out with the child in her arms. She heard him call twice after her down the road in a terrible voice, and fled. Ah! But you should have seen stirring behind the dull, blurred glance of these eyes the spectre of the fear which had hunted her on that night 3.5 miles to the door of Foster's cottage. I did the next day, and it was I who found him lying face down and his body in a puddle just outside the little wicket gate. I'd been called out that night to an urgent case in the village, and on my way home at daybreak passed by the cottage. The door stood open. My man helped me to carry him in. We laid him on the couch. The lamp smoked, the fire was out, the chill of the stormy night oozed from the cheerless yellow paper on the wall. "Amy," I called aloud, and my voice seemed to lose itself in the emptiness of this tiny house as if I had cried in a desert. He opened his eyes. "Gone," he said distinctly. I had only asked for water. Only for a little water. He was muddy. I covered him up and stood waiting in silence, catching a painfully gasped word now and then. They were no longer in his own language. The fever had left him, taking with it the heat of life. And with his panting breast and lustrous eyes, he reminded me again of a wild creature under the net, of a bird caught in a snare. She had left him. She had left him, sick, helpless, thirsty. The spear of the hunter had entered his very soul. "Why?" he cried, in the penetrating and indignant voice of a man calling to a responsible maker. A gust of wind and a swish of rain answered. And as I turned away to shut the door, he pronounced the word merciful and expired. Eventually, I certified heart failure as the immediate cause of death. His heart must have indeed failed him, or else he might have stood this night of storm and exposure too. I closed his eyes and drove away. Not very far from the cottage, I met Foster walking sturdily between the dripping hedges with his collie at his heels. "Do you know where your daughter is?" I asked. "Don't I?" he cried. "I'm going to talk to him a bit. Frightening a poor woman like this." "He won't frighten her any more," I said. "He is dead." He struck with his stick at the mud. "And there's the child." Then, after thinking deeply for a while, "I don't know that it isn't for the best." That's what he said, and she says nothing at all now, not a word of him, never. Is his image as utterly gone from her mind as his lithe and striding figure, his carolling voice are gone from our fields? He is no longer before her eyes to excite her imagination into a passion of love or fear, and his memory seems to have vanished from her dull brain as a shadow passes away upon a white screen. She lives in the cottage and works for Miss Swaffer. She is Amy Foster for everybody, and the child is Amy Foster's boy. She calls him Johnny, which means Little John. It is impossible to say whether this name recalls anything to her. Does she ever think of the past? I have seen her hanging over the boy's cot in a very passion of maternal tenderness. The little fellow was lying on his back, a little frightened at me, but very still, with his big black eyes, with his fluttered air of a bird in a snare. And looking at him, I seemed to see again the other one, the father, cast out mysteriously by the sea to perish in the supreme disaster of loneliness and despair. Youth, The Adventures and Trials of a Young Sailor, a short story by Joseph Conrad. But the dwarf answered, "No, something human is dearer to me than the wealth of all the world." Grimm's Tales. This could have occurred nowhere but in England, where men and sea interpenetrate, so to speak, the sea entering into the life of most men, and the men knowing something or everything about the sea in the way of amusement, of travel, or of breadwinning. We were sitting round a mahogany table that reflected the bottle, the claret glasses, and our faces as we leaned on our elbows. There was a director of companies, an accountant, a lawyer, Marlowe, and myself. The director had been a Conway boy. The accountant had served 4 years at sea. The lawyer, a fine, crusted Tory, high churchman, the best of old fellows, the soul of honour, had been chief officer in the P&O service in the good old days when mailboats were square-rigged at least on 2 masts and used to come down the China Sea before a fair monsoon with stun sails set alow and aloft. We all began life in the merchant service. Between the 5 of us, there was the strong bond of the sea, and also the fellowship of the craft, which no amount of enthusiasm for yachting, cruising, and so on can give, since one is only the amusement of life, and the other is life itself. Marlowe, at least I think that is how he spelt his name, told the story, or rather the chronicle, of a voyage. Yes, I have seen a little of the eastern seas, but what I remember best is my first voyage there. You fellows know there are those voyages that seem ordered for the illustration of life, that might stand for a symbol of existence. You fight, work, sweat, nearly kill yourself, sometimes do kill yourself, trying to accomplish something, and you can't. Not from any fault of yours. You simply can do nothing, neither great nor little, not a thing in the world, not even marry an old maid, or get a wretched 600-ton cargo of coal to its port of destination. It was altogether a memorable affair. It was my first voyage to the East, and my first voyage as second mate. It was also my skipper's first command. You'll admit it was time. He was 60 if a day, a little man with a broad, not very straight back, with bowed shoulders and one leg more bandy than the other. He had that queer, twisted-about appearance you see so often in men who work in the fields. He had a nutcracker face, chin and nose trying to come together over a sunken mouth, and it was framed in iron-grey, fluffy hair that looked like a chin-strap of cotton wool sprinkled with coal dust. And he had blue eyes in that old face of his, which were amazingly like a boy's, with that candid expression some quite common men preserve to the end of their days by a rare internal gift of simplicity of heart and rectitude of soul. What induced him to accept me was a wonder. I had come out of a crack Australian clipper where I had been third officer, and he seemed to have a prejudice against crack clippers as aristocratic and high-toned. He said to me, "You know, in this ship, you will have to work." I said I had to work in every ship I had ever been in. "Ah, but this is different, and you gentlemen out of them big ships. But there, I dare say you will do. Join tomorrow." I joined tomorrow. It was 22 years ago, and I was just 20. How time passes. It was one of the happiest days of my life. Fancy, second mate for the first time, a really responsible officer. I wouldn't have thrown up my new billet for a fortune. The mate looked me over carefully. He was also an old chap, but of another stamp. He had a Roman nose, a snow-white, long beard, and his name was Marn, but he insisted that it should be pronounced Man. He was well connected, yet there was something wrong with his luck, and he had never got on. As to the captain, he had been for years in coasters, then in the Mediterranean, and last in the West Indian trade. He had never been round the Capes. He could just write a kind of sketchy hand, and didn't care for writing at all. Both were thorough good seamen, of course, and between those two old chaps I felt like a small boy between two grandfathers. The ship also was old. Her name was the Judea. Queer name, isn't it? She belonged to a man Wilcox, some name like that. But he has been bankrupt and dead these 20 years or more, and his name don't matter. She had been laid up in Shadwell Basin for ever so long. You may imagine her state. She was all rust, dust, grime, soot aloft, dirt on deck. To me it was like coming out of a palace into a ruined cottage. She was about 400 tons, had a primitive windlass, wooden latches to the doors, not a bit of brass about her, and a big square stern. There was on it, below her name in big letters, a lot of scroll work with the gilt off, and some sort of a coat of arms with the motto, "Do or Die," underneath. I remember it took my fancy immensely. There was a touch of romance in it, something that made me love the old thing, something that appealed to my youth. We left London in ballast, sand ballast, to load a cargo of coal in a northern port for Bangkok. Bangkok, I thrilled. I had been 6 years at sea, but had only seen Melbourne and Sydney, very good places, charming places in their way. But Bangkok? We worked out of the Thames under canvas, with a North Sea pilot on board. His name was German, and he dodged all day long about the galley drying his handkerchief before the stove. Apparently, he never slept. He was a dismal man, with a perpetual tear sparkling at the end of his nose, who either had been in trouble, or was in trouble, or expected to be in trouble, couldn't be happy unless something went wrong. He mistrusted my youth, my common sense, and my seamanship, and made a point of showing it in 100 little ways. I dare say he was right. It seems to me I knew very little then, and I know not much more now, but I cherish a hate for that German to this day. We were a week working up as far as Yarmouth Roads, and then we got into a gale, the famous October gale of 22 years ago. It was wind, lightning, sleet, snow, and a terrific sea. We were flying light, and you may imagine how bad it was when I tell you we had smashed bulwarks and a flooded deck. On the second night, she shifted her ballast into the lee bow, and by that time we had been blown off somewhere on the Dogger Bank. There was nothing for it but go below with shovels and try to right her, and there we were in that vast hold, gloomy like a cavern, the tallow dips stuck and flickering on the beams, the gale howling above, the ship tossing about like mad on her side. There we all were, Jermyn, the captain, everyone, hardly able to keep our feet, engaged on that gravedigger's work, and trying to toss shovelfuls of wet sand up to windward. At every tumble of the ship, you could see vaguely in the dim light men falling down with a great flourish of shovels. One of the ship's boys, we had two, impressed by the weirdness of the scene, wept as if his heart would break. We could hear him blubbering somewhere in the shadows. On the third day, the gale died out, and by a North Country tug picked us up. We took 16 days in all to get from London to the Tyne. When we got into dock, we had lost our turn for loading, and they hauled us off to a tier where we remained for a month. Mrs. Beard, the captain's name was Beard, came from Colchester to see the old man. She lived on board. The crew of runners had left, and there remained only the officers, one boy and the steward, a mulatto who answered to the name of Abraham. Mrs. Beard was an old woman with a face all wrinkled and ruddy like a winter apple and the figure of a young girl. She caught sight of me once, sewing on a button, and insisted on having my shirts to repair. This was something different from the captain's wives I had known on board crack clippers. When I brought her the shirts, she said, "And the socks. They want mending, I'm sure, and John's, Captain Beard's. Things are all in order now. I would be glad of something to do." Bless the old woman. She overhauled my outfit for me, and meantime I read for the first time Sartor Resartus and Burnaby's Ride to Khiva. I didn't understand much of the first then, but I remember I preferred the soldier to the philosopher at the time, a preference which life has only confirmed. One was a man, and the other was either more or less. However, they are both dead, and Mrs. Beard is dead, and youth, strength, genius, thoughts, achievements, simple hearts, all dies. No matter. They loaded us at last. We shipped a crew, 8 able seamen and 2 boys. We hauled off one evening to the buoys at the dock gates, ready to go out, and with a fair prospect of beginning the voyage next day. Mrs. Beard was to start for home by a late train. When the ship was fast, we went to tea. We sat rather silent through the meal, Marn, the old couple, and I. I finished first and slipped away for a smoke, my cabin being in a deck house just against the poop. It was high water, blowing fresh with a drizzle. The double dock gates were opened, and the steam colliers were going in and out in the darkness with their lights burning bright, a great plashing of propellers, rattling of winches, and a lot of hailing on the pierheads. I watched the procession of headlights gliding high and of green lights gliding low in the night, when suddenly a red gleam flashed at me, vanished, came into view again, and remained. The fore end of a steamer loomed up close. I shouted down the cabin, "Come up, quick!" and then heard a startled voice saying afar in the dark, "Stop her, sir!" A bell jingled. Another voice cried warningly, "We are going right into that bark, sir." The answer to this was a gruff all right, and the next thing was a heavy crash as the steamer struck a glancing blow with the bluff of her bow about our fore-rigging. There was a moment of confusion, yelling and running about. Steam roared. Then somebody was heard saying, "All clear, sir." "Are you all right?" asked the gruff voice. I had jumped forward to see the damage and hailed back, "I think so." "Easy astern," said the gruff voice. A bell jingled. "What steamer is that?" screamed Mahan. By that time she was no more to us than a bulky shadow manoeuvring a little way off. They shouted at us some name, a woman's name, Miranda or Melissa, or some such thing. "This means another month in this beastly hole," said Mahan to me, as we peered with lamps about the splintered bulwarks and broken braces. "But where's the captain?" We had not heard or seen anything of him all that time. We went aft to look. A doleful voice arose, hailing somewhere in the middle of the dock, "Judea ahoy!" How the devil did he get there? "Hello!" we shouted. "I am adrift in our boat without oars," he cried. A belated waterman offered his services, and Mahan struck a bargain with him for £0.50 to tow our skipper alongside. But it was Mrs. Beard that came up the ladder first. They had been floating about the dock in that mizzly cold rain for nearly an hour. I was never so surprised in my life. It appears that when he heard my shout come up, he understood at once what was the matter, caught up his wife, ran on deck and across, and down into our boat, which was fast to the ladder. Not bad for a 60-year-old. Just imagine that old fellow saving heroically in his arms that old woman, the woman of his life. He set her down on a thwart and was ready to climb back on board when the painter came adrift somehow, and away they went together. Of course, in the confusion we did not hear him shouting. He looked abashed. She said cheerfully, "I suppose it does not matter my losing the train now." "No, Jenny, you go below and get warm," he growled. Then to us, "A sailor has no business with a wife," I say. There I was, out of the ship. Well, no harm done this time. Let's go and look at what that fool of a steamer smashed. It wasn't much, but it delayed us 3 weeks. At the end of that time, the captain being engaged with his agents, I carried Mrs. Beard's bag to the railway station and put her all comfy into a third-class carriage. She lowered the window to say, "You are a good young man. If you see John, Captain Beard, without his muffler at night, just remind him from me to keep his throat well wrapped up." "Certainly, Mrs. Beard," I said. "You are a good young man. I noticed how attentive you are to John, to Captain—" The train pulled out suddenly. I took my cap off to the old woman. I never saw her again. Pass the bottle. We went to sea next day. When we made that start for Bangkok, we had been already 3 months out of London. We had expected to be a fortnight or so, at the outside. It was January and the weather was beautiful. The beautiful, sunny winter weather that has more charm than in the summertime, because it is unexpected and crisp, and you know it can't last long. It's like a windfall, like a godsend, like an unexpected piece of luck. It lasted all down the North Sea, all down Channel, and it lasted till we were 300 miles or so to the westward of the Lizards. Then the wind went round to the sou-west and began to pipe up. In 2 days it blew a gale. The Judea, hove to, wallowed on the Atlantic like an old candle-box. It blew day after day. It blew with spite, without interval, without mercy, without rest. The world was nothing but an immensity of great foaming waves rushing at us under a sky low enough to touch with the hand and dirty like a smoked ceiling. In the stormy space surrounding us, there was as much flying spray as air. Day after day and night after night, there was nothing round the ship but the howl of the wind, the tumult of the sea. the noise of water pouring over her deck. There was no rest for her, and no rest for us. She tossed, she pitched, she stood on her head, she sat on her tail, she rolled, she groaned, and we had to hold on while on deck and cling to our bunks when below in a constant effort of body and worry of mind. One night, Mahon spoke through the small window of my berth. It opened right into my very bed, and I was lying there sleepless, in my boots, feeling as though I had not slept for years and could not if I tried. He said excitedly, "You got the sounding rod in here, Marlowe. I can't get the pumps to suck. By God, it's no child's play." I gave him the sounding rod and lay down again, trying to think of various things, but I thought only of the pumps. When I came on deck, they were still at it, and my watch relieved at the pumps. By the light of the lantern brought on deck to examine the sounding rod, I caught a glimpse of their weary, serious faces. We pumped all the 4 hours. We pumped all night, all day, all the week, watch and watch. She was working herself loose and leaked badly, not enough to drown us at once, but enough to kill us with the work at the pumps. And while we pumped, the ship was going from us piecemeal. The bulwarks went, the stanchions were torn out, the ventilators smashed, the cabin door burst in. There was not a dry spot in the ship. She was being gutted bit by bit. The longboat changed, as if by magic, into matchwood where she stood in her gripes. I had lashed her myself, and was rather proud of my handiwork, which had withstood so long the malice of the sea. And we pumped, and there was no break in the weather. The sea was white like a sheet of foam, like a cauldron of boiling milk. There was not a break in the clouds, no, not the size of a man's hand, no, not for so much as 10 seconds. There was for us no sky, there were for us no stars, no sun, no universe, nothing but angry clouds and an infuriated sea. We pumped watch and watch for dear life, and it seemed to last for months, for years, for all eternity, as though we had been dead and gone to a hell for sailors. We forgot the day of the week, the name of the month, what year it was, and whether we had ever been ashore. The sails blew away, she lay broadside on under a weathercloth, the ocean poured over her, and we did not care. We turned those handles and had the eyes of idiots. As soon as we had crawled on deck, I used to take a round turn with a rope about the men, the pumps and the mainmast, and we turned incessantly, with the water to our waists, to our necks, over our heads. It was all one. We had forgotten how it felt to be dry. And there was somewhere in me the thought, by Jove, this is the deuce of an adventure, something you read about, and it is my first voyage as second mate, and I am only 20, and here I am lasting it out as well as any of these men, and keeping my chaps up to the mark. I was pleased. I would not have given up the experience for worlds. I had moments of exultation. Whenever the old dismantled craft pitched heavily with her counter high in the air, she seemed to me to throw up like an appeal, like a defiance, like a cry to the clouds without mercy, the words written on her stern, Judea, London, do or die. Oh, youth, the strength of it, the faith of it, the imagination of it. To me, she was not an old rattletrap carting about the world a lot of coal for a freight. To me, she was the endeavour, the test, the trial of life. I think of her with pleasure, with affection, with regret, as you would think of someone dead you have loved. I shall never forget her. Pass the bottle. One night, when tied to the mast, as I explained, we were pumping on, deafened with the wind, and without spirit enough in us to wish ourselves dead, a heavy sea crashed aboard and swept clean over us. As soon as I got my breath, I shouted, as in duty-bound, "Keep on, boys!" When suddenly I felt something hard floating on deck strike the calf of my leg. I made a grab at it and missed. It was so dark we could not see each other's faces within a foot. You understand. After that thump, the ship kept quiet for a while, and the thing, whatever it was, struck my leg again. This time I caught it, and it was a saucepan. At first, being stupid with fatigue and thinking of nothing but the pumps, I did not understand what I had in my hand. Suddenly, it dawned upon me, and I shouted, "Boys, the house on deck is gone. Leave this and let's look for the cook." There was a deck house forward, which contained the galley, the cook's berth, and the quarters of the crew. As we had expected for days to see it swept away, the hands had been ordered to sleep in the cabin, the only safe place in the ship. The steward, Abraham, however, persisted in clinging to his berth, stupidly, like a mule, from sheer fright, I believe, like an animal that won't leave a stable falling in an earthquake. So we went to look for him. It was chancing death, since once out of our lashings we were as exposed as if on a raft. But we went. The house was shattered as if a shell had exploded inside. Most of it had gone overboard. Stove, men's quarters, and their property, all was gone. But 2 posts, holding a portion of the bulkhead to which Abraham's bunk was attached, remained as if by a miracle. We groped in the ruins and came upon this, and there he was, sitting in his bunk, surrounded by foam and wreckage, jabbering cheerfully to himself. He was out of his mind, completely and forever mad, with this sudden shock coming upon the fag end of his endurance. We snatched him up, lugged him aft, and pitched him head first down the cabin companion. You understand there was no time to carry him down with infinite precautions and wait to see how he got on. Those below would pick him up at the bottom of the stairs all right. We were in a hurry to go back to the pumps. That business could not wait. A bad leak is an inhuman thing. One would think that the sole purpose of that fiendish gale had been to make a lunatic of that poor devil of a mulatto. It eased before morning, and next day the sky cleared, and as the sea went down, the leak took up. When it came to bending a fresh set of sails, the crew demanded to put back, and really, there was nothing else to do. Boats gone, decks swept clean, cabin gutted, men without a stitch, but what they stood in, stores spoiled, ship strained. We put her head for home and, would you believe it? The wind came east right in our teeth. It blew fresh, it blew continuously. We had to beat up every inch of the way, but she did not leak so badly, the water keeping comparatively smooth. 2 hours pumping in every 4 is no joke, but it kept her afloat as far as Falmouth. The good people there live on casualties of the sea, and no doubt were glad to see us. A hungry crowd of shipwrights sharpened their chisels at the sight of that carcass of a ship, and, by Jove, they had pretty pickings off us before they were done. I fancy the owner was already in a tight place. There were delays. Then it was decided to take part of the cargo out and caulk her topsides. This was done, the repairs finished, cargo reshipped. A new crew came on board, and we went out for Bangkok. At the end of a week, we were back again. The crew said they weren't going to Bangkok, 150 days passage, in a something hooker that wanted pumping 8 hours out of the 24, and the nautical papers inserted again the little paragraph. Judea, bark, Tyne to Bangkok, coals, put back to Falmouth leaky and with crew refusing duty. There were more delays, more tinkering. The owner came down for a day and said she was as right as a little fiddle. Poor old Captain Beard looked like the ghost of a Geordie skipper, through the worry and humiliation of it. Remember, he was 60, and it was his first command. Mayen said it was a foolish business, and would end badly. I loved the ship more than ever, and wanted awfully to get to Bangkok. To Bangkok. Magic name, blessed name. Mesopotamia wasn't a patch on it. Remember, I was 20, and it was my first second mate's billet, and the East was waiting for me. We went out and anchored in the outer roads with a fresh crew, the third. She leaked worse than ever. It was as if those confounded shipwrights had actually made a hole in her. This time, we did not even go outside. The crew simply refused to man the windlass. They towed us back to the inner harbour, and we became a fixture, a feature, an institution of the place. People pointed us out to visitors as the air bark that's going to Bangkok has been here 6 months. Put back 3 times. On holidays, the small boys pulling about in boats would hail, "Judea, ahoy!" And if a head showed above the rail, shouted, "Where you bound to? Bangkok!" and jeered. We were only 3 on board. The poor old skipper mooned in the cabin. Marn undertook the cooking and unexpectedly developed all a Frenchman's genius for preparing nice little messes. I looked languidly after the rigging. We became citizens of Falmouth. Every shopkeeper knew us. At the barbers or tobacconists, they asked familiarly, "Do you think you will ever get to Bangkok?" Meantime, the owner, the underwriters, and the charterers squabbled amongst themselves in London, and our pay went on. Pass the bottle. It was horrid. Morally, it was worse than pumping for life. It seemed as though we had been forgotten by the world, belonged to nobody, would get nowhere. It seemed that, as if bewitched, we would have to live for ever and ever in that inner harbour, a derision and a byword to generations of longshore loafers and dishonest boatmen. I obtained 3 months' pay and a 5 days' leave, and made a rush for London. It took me a day to get there and pretty well another to come back, but 3 months' pay went all the same. I don't know what I did with it. I went to a music hall, I believe, lunched, dined, and supped in a swell place in Regent Street, and was back to time, with nothing but a complete set of Byron's works and a new railway rug to show for 3 months from work. The boatman who pulled me off to the ship said, "Hello? I thought you had left the old thing. She will never get to Bangkok." "That's all you know about it," I said scornfully, but I didn't like that prophecy at all. Suddenly a man, some kind of agent to somebody, appeared with full powers. He had grog blossoms all over his face, an indomitable energy, and was a jolly soul. We leaped into life again. A hulk came alongside, took our cargo, and then we went into dry dock to get our copper stripped. No wonder she leaked. The poor thing, strained beyond endurance by the gale, had, as if in disgust, spat out all the oakum of her lower seams. She was recorked, new coppered, and made as tight as a bottle. We went back to the hulk and reshipped our cargo. Then, on a fine moonlight night, all the rats left the ship. We had been infested with them. They had destroyed our sails, consumed more stores than the crew, affably shared our beds and our dangers, and now, when the ship was made seaworthy, concluded to clear out. I called Marn to enjoy the spectacle. Rat after rat appeared on our rail, took a last look over his shoulder, and leaped with a hollow thud into the empty hulk. We tried to count them, but soon lost the tail. Marn said, "Well, well, don't talk to me about the intelligence of rats. They ought to have left before, when we had that narrow squeak from foundering. There you have the proof how silly is the superstition about them. They leave a good ship for an old rotten hulk, where there is nothing to eat too, the fools. I don't believe they know what is safe or what is good for them, any more than you or I." And after some more talk, we agreed that the wisdom of rats had been grossly overrated, being in fact no greater than that of men. The story of the ship was known, by this, all up the channel from Land's End to the Forelands, and we could get no crew on the south coast. They sent us one all complete from Liverpool, and we left once more for Bangkok. We had fair breezes, smooth water right into the tropics, and the old Judea lumbered along in the sunshine. When she went 8 knots, everything cracked aloft, and we tied our caps to our heads, but mostly she strolled on at the rate of 3 miles an hour. What could you expect? She was tired. That old ship. Her youth was where mine is, where yours is, you fellows who listen to this yarn. And what friend would throw your years and your weariness in your face? We didn't grumble at her. To us, aft at least, it seemed as though we had been born in her, reared in her, had lived in her for ages, had never known any other ship. I would just as soon have abused the old village church at home for not being a cathedral. And for me, there was also my youth to make me patient. There was all the East before me, and all life, and the thought that I had been tried in that ship and had come out pretty well. And I thought of men of old who, centuries ago, went that road in ships that sailed no better, to the land of palms and spices and yellow sands, and of brown nations ruled by kings more cruel than Nero the Roman, and more splendid than Solomon the Jew. The old bark lumbered on, heavy with her age and the burden of her cargo, while I lived the life of youth in ignorance and hope. She lumbered on through an interminable procession of days, and the fresh gilding flashed back at the setting sun seemed to cry out over the darkening sea the words painted on her stern: Judea, London, do or die. Then we entered the Indian Ocean and steered northerly for Java Head. The winds were light. Weeks slipped by. She crawled on, do or die, and people at home began to think of posting us as overdue. One Saturday evening, I being off duty, the men asked me to give them an extra bucket of water or so for washing clothes. As I did not wish to screw on the freshwater pump so late, I went forward whistling, and with a key in my hand to unlock the forepeak scuttle, intending to serve the water out of a spare tank we kept there. The smell down below was as unexpected as it was frightful. One would have thought hundreds of paraffin lamps had been flaring and smoking in that hole for days. I was glad to get out. The man with me coughed and said, "Funny smell, sir." I answered negligently, "It's good for the health, they say," and walked aft. The first thing I did was to put my head down the square of the midship ventilator. As I lifted the lid, a visible breath, something like a thin fog, a puff of faint haze rose from the opening. The ascending air was hot and had a heavy, sooty, paraffin-y smell. I gave one sniff and put down the lid gently. It was no use choking myself. The cargo was on fire. Next day she began to smoke in earnest. You see, it was to be expected, for though the coal was of a safe kind, the cargo had been so handled, so broken up with handling, that it looked more like smithy coal than anything else. Then it had been wetted, more than once. It rained all the time we were taking it back from the hulk, and now, with this long passage, it got heated, and there was another case of spontaneous combustion. The captain called us into the cabin. He had a chart spread on the table and looked unhappy. He said, "The coast of West Australia is near, but I mean to proceed to our destination. It is the hurricane month too, but we will just keep her head for Bangkok and fight the fire. No more putting back anywhere if we all get roasted. We will try first to stifle this air-damned combustion by want of air." We tried. We battened down everything, and still she smoked. The smoke kept coming out through imperceptible crevices. It forced itself through bulkheads and covers. It oozed here and there and everywhere in slender threads, in an invisible film, in an incomprehensible manner. It made its way into the cabin, into the forecastle. It poisoned the sheltered places on the deck. It could be sniffed as high as the main yard. It was clear that if the smoke came out, the air came in. This was disheartening. This combustion refused to be stifled. We resolved to try water and took the hatches off. Enormous volumes of smoke, whitish, yellowish, thick, greasy, misty, choking, ascended as high as the trucks. All hands cleared out aft. Then the poisonous cloud blew away, and we went back to work in a smoke that was no thicker now than that of an ordinary factory chimney. We rigged the force pump, got the hose along, and by it burst. Well, it was as old as the ship, a prehistoric hose and past repair. Then we pumped with the feeble head pump, drew water with buckets, and in this way managed in time to pour lots of Indian Ocean into the main hatch. The bright stream flashed in sunshine, fell into a layer of white crawling smoke, and vanished on the black surface of coal. Steam ascended, mingling with the smoke. We poured salt water as into a barrel without a bottom. It was our fate to pump in that ship, to pump out of her, to pump into her. And after keeping water out of her to save ourselves from being drowned, we frantically poured water into her to save ourselves from being burnt. And she crawled on, do or die, in the serene weather. The sky was a miracle of purity, a miracle of azure. The sea was polished, was blue, was pellucid, was sparkling like a precious stone, extending on all sides, all round to the horizon, as if the whole terrestrial globe had been one jewel, one colossal sapphire, a single gem fashioned into a planet. And on the lustre of the great calm waters, the Judea glided imperceptibly, enveloped in languid and unclean vapours, in a lazy cloud that drifted to leeward, light and slow, a pestiferous cloud defiling the splendor of sea and sky. All this time, of course, we saw no fire. The cargo smoldered at the bottom somewhere. Once Mayan, as we were working side by side, said to me with a queer smile, "Now, if she only would spring a tidy leak, like that time when we first left the channel, it would put a stopper on this fire. Wouldn't it?" I remarked irrelevantly. "Do you remember the rats?" We fought the fire and sailed the ship to as carefully as though nothing had been the matter. The steward cooked and attended on us. Of the other 12 men, 8 worked while 4 rested. Everyone took his turn, captain included. There was equality, and if not exactly fraternity, then a deal of good feeling. Sometimes a man, as he dashed a bucketful of water down the hatchway, would yell out, "Hurrah for Bangkok!" and the rest laughed. But generally we were taciturn and serious, and thirsty. Oh, how thirsty! And we had to be careful with the water, strict allowance. The ship smoked, the sun blazed. Pass the bottle. We tried everything. We even made an attempt to dig down to the fire. No good, of course. No man could remain more than a minute below. Marn, who went first, fainted there, and the man who went to fetch him out did likewise. We lugged them out on deck. Then I leaped down to show how easily it could be done. They had learned wisdom by that time, and contented themselves by fishing for me with a chain hook tied to a broom handle, I believe. I did not offer to go and fetch up my shovel, which was left down below. Things began to look bad. We put the longboat into the water. The second boat was ready to swing out. We had also another, a 14-foot thing, on davits aft, where it was quite safe. Then behold, the smoke suddenly decreased. We redoubled our efforts to flood the bottom of the ship. In 2 days there was no smoke at all. Everybody was on the broad grin. This was on a Friday. On Saturday, no work, but sailing the ship, of course, was done. The men washed their clothes and their faces for the first time in a fortnight, and I had a special dinner given them. They spoke of spontaneous combustion with contempt, and implied they were the boys to put out combustions. Somehow, we all felt as though we each had inherited a large fortune, but a beastly smell of burning hung about the ship. Captain Beard had hollow eyes and sunken cheeks. I had never noticed so much before how twisted and bowed he was. He and Marn prowled soberly about hatches and ventilators, sniffing. It struck me suddenly poor Marn was a very, very old chap. As to me, I was as pleased and proud as though I had helped to win a great naval battle. Oh, youth! The night was fine. In the morning, a homeward-bound ship passed us hull down, the first we had seen for months. But we were nearing the land at last, Java Head being about 190 miles off and nearly due north. Next day it was my watch on deck from 8 to 12. At breakfast, the captain observed, "It's wonderful how that smell hangs about the cabin." About 10, the mate being on the poop, I stepped down on the main deck for a moment. The carpenter's bench stood abaft the mainmast. I leaned against it, sucking at my pipe, and the carpenter, a young chap, came to talk to me. He remarked, "I think we have done very well, haven't we?" And then I perceived with annoyance the fool was trying to tilt the bench. I said curtly, "Don't, Chips," and immediately became aware of a queer sensation, of an absurd delusion. I seemed somehow to be in the air. I heard all round me like a pent-up breath released, as if 1,000 giants simultaneously had said "foo," and felt a dull concussion which made my ribs ache suddenly. No doubt about it, I was in the air, and my body was describing a short parabola. But short as it was, I had the time to think several thoughts in, as far as I can remember, the following order. This can't be the carpenter. What is it? Some accident. Submarine volcano. Coals, gas? By Jove, we are being blown up. Everybody's dead. I am falling into the afterhatch. I see fire in it. The coal dust suspended in the air of the hold had glowed dull red at the moment of the explosion. In the twinkling of an eye, in an infinitesimal fraction of a second since the first tilt of the bench, I was sprawling full length on the cargo. I picked myself up and scrambled out. It was quick like a rebound. The deck was a wilderness of smashed timber, lying crosswise like trees in a wood after a hurricane. An immense curtain of soiled rags waved gently before me. It was the mainsail blown to strips. I thought, the masts will be toppling over directly, and to get out of the way, bolted on all fours towards the poop ladder. The first person I saw was Mayan, with eyes like saucers, his mouth open, and the long white hair standing straight on end round his head like a silver halo. He was just about to go down when the sight of the main deck stirring, heaving up, and changing into splinters before his eyes petrified him on the top step. I stared at him in unbelief, and he stared at me with a queer kind of shocked curiosity. I did not know that I had no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, that my young moustache was burnt off, that my face was black, one cheek laid open, my nose cut, and my chin bleeding. I had lost my cap, one of my slippers, and my shirt was torn to rags. Of all this I was not aware. I was amazed to see the ship still afloat, the poop deck whole, and most of all, to see anybody alive. Also, the peace of the sky and the serenity of the sea were distinctly surprising. I suppose I expected to see them convulsed with horror. Pass the bottle. There was a voice hailing the ship from somewhere, in the air, in the sky. I couldn't tell. Presently I saw the captain, and he was mad. He asked me eagerly, "Where's the cabin table?" And to hear such a question was a frightful shock. I had just been blown up, you understand, and vibrated with that experience. I wasn't quite sure whether I was alive. Mayan began to stamp with both feet and yelled at him, "Good God! Don't you see the deck's blown out of her?" I found my voice and stammered out as if conscious of some gross neglect of duty. "I don't know where the cabin table is." It was like an absurd dream. Do you know what he wanted next? Well, he wanted to trim the yards. Very placidly, and as if lost in thought, he insisted on having the foreyard squared. "I don't know if there's anybody alive," said Mahon, almost tearfully. "Surely," he said gently, "there will be enough left to square the foreyard." The old chap, it seems, was in his own berth, winding up the chronometers, when the shock sent him spinning. Immediately it occurred to him, as he said afterwards, that the ship had struck something, and he ran out into the cabin. There, he saw, the cabin table had vanished somewhere. The deck being blown up, it had fallen down into the lazarette, of course. Where we had our breakfast that morning, he saw only a great hole in the floor. This appeared to him so awfully mysterious, and impressed him so immensely, that what he saw and heard after he got on deck were mere trifles in comparison. And mark, he noticed directly the wheel deserted and his bark off her course, and his only thought was to get that miserable, stripped, undecked, smouldering shell of a ship back again, with her head pointing at her port of destination. Bangkok! That's what he was after. I tell you, this quiet, bowed, bandy-legged, almost deformed little man was immense in the singleness of his idea, and in his placid ignorance of our agitation. He motioned us forward with a commanding gesture, and went to take the wheel himself. Yes, that was the first thing we did, trim the yards of that wreck. No one was killed or even disabled, but everyone was more or less hurt. You should have seen them. Some were in rags with black faces, like coal heavers, like sweeps, and had bullet heads that seemed closely cropped, but were in fact singed to the skin. Others of the watch below, awakened by being shot out from their collapsing bunks, shivered incessantly and kept on groaning even as we went about our work. But they all worked. That crew of Liverpool hard cases had in them the right stuff. It's my experience they always have. It is the sea that gives it, the vastness, the loneliness surrounding their dark, stolid souls. Ah, well, we stumbled. We crept, we fell, we barked our shins on the wreckage, we hauled. The masts stood, but we did not know how much they might be charred down below. It was nearly calm, but a long swell ran from the west and made her roll. They might go at any moment. We looked at them with apprehension. One could not foresee which way they would fall. Then we retreated aft and looked about us. The deck was a tangle of planks on edge, of planks on end, of splinters, of ruined woodwork. The masts rose from that chaos like big trees above a matted undergrowth. The interstices of that mass of wreckage were full of something whitish, sluggish, stirring, of something that was like a greasy fog. The smoke of the invisible fire was coming up again, was trailing, like a poisonous thick mist in some valley choked with dead wood. Already lazy wisps were beginning to curl upwards amongst the mass of splinters. Here and there a piece of timber, stuck upright, resembled a post. Half of a fife rail had been shot through the foresail, and the sky made a patch of glorious blue in the ignobly soiled canvas. A portion of several boards holding together had fallen across the rail, and one end protruded overboard, like a gangway leading upon nothing, like a gangway leading over the deep sea, leading to death, as if inviting us to walk the plank at once and be done with our ridiculous troubles. And still, the air, the sky, a ghost, something invisible was hailing the ship. Someone had the sense to look over, and there was the helmsman who had impulsively jumped overboard, anxious to come back. He yelled and swam lustily like a merman, keeping up with the ship. We threw him a rope, and presently he stood amongst us, streaming with water and very crestfallen. The captain had surrendered the wheel, and apart, elbow on rail and chin in hand, gazed at the sea wistfully. We asked ourselves, what next? I thought, now this is something like. This is great. I wonder what will happen. Oh, youth! Suddenly Mahon sighted a steamer far astern. Captain Beard said, we may do something with her yet. We hoisted 2 flags, which said in the international language of the sea, on fire, want immediate assistance. The steamer grew bigger rapidly, and by spoke with 2 flags on her foremast, I am coming to your assistance. In half an hour she was abreast, to windward, within hail, and rolling slightly, with her engines stopped. We lost our composure, and yelled all together with excitement, we've been blown up! A man in a white helmet on the bridge cried, yes, all right, and he nodded his head and smiled, and made soothing motions with his hand, as though at a lot of frightened children. One of the boats dropped in the water and walked towards us upon the sea with her long oars. 4 calashes pulled a swinging stroke. This was my first sight of Malay seamen. I've known them since, but what struck me then was their unconcern. They came alongside, and even the bowman standing up and holding to our main chains with the boat hook did not deign to lift his head for a glance. I thought people who had been blown up deserved more attention. A little man, dry like a chip and agile like a monkey, clambered up. It was the mate of the steamer. He gave one look and cried, oh, boys, you had better quit. We were silent. He talked apart with the captain for a time, seemed to argue with him. Then they went away together to the steamer. When our skipper came back, we learned that the steamer was the Somerville, Captain Nash, from West Australia to Singapore via Batavia with mails, and that the agreement was she should tow us to Anjer or Batavia, if possible, where we could extinguish the fire by scuttling, and then proceed on our voyage to Bangkok. The old man seemed excited. We will do it yet, he said to Mahon fiercely. He shook his fist at the sky. Nobody else said a word. At noon, the steamer began to tow. She went ahead slim and high, and what was left of the Judea followed at the end of 70 fathom of tow rope, followed her swiftly like a cloud of smoke with mastheads protruding above. We went aloft to furl the sails. We coughed on the yards and were careful about the bunts. Do you see the lot of us there, putting a neat furl on the sails of that ship doomed to arrive nowhere? There was not a man who didn't think that at any moment the masts would topple over. From aloft, we could not see the ship for smoke, and they worked carefully, passing the gaskets with even turns. Harbour furl, aloft there, cried Mahon from below. You understand this. I don't think one of those chaps expected to get down in the usual way. When we did, I heard them saying to each other, well, I thought we would come down overboard, in a lump, sticks and all. Blame me if I didn't. That's what I was thinking to myself, would answer wearily another battered and bandaged scarecrow. And, mind, these were men without the drilled-in habit of obedience. To an onlooker, they would be a lot of profane scallywags without a redeeming point. What made them do it? What made them obey me when I, thinking consciously how fine it was, made them drop the bunt of the foresail twice to try and do it better? What? They had no professional reputation, no examples, no praise. It wasn't a sense of duty. They all knew well enough how to shirk and laze and dodge when they had a mind to it, and mostly they had. Was it the £2.10 a month that sent them there? They didn't think their pay half good enough. No, it was something in them, something inborn and subtle and everlasting. I don't say positively that the crew of a French or German merchantman wouldn't have done it, but I doubt whether it would have been done in the same way. There was a completeness in it, something solid like a principle, and masterful like an instinct, a disclosure of something secret, of that hidden something, that gift of good or evil that makes racial difference, that shapes the fate of nations. It was that night at 10 that for the first time since we'd been fighting it, we saw the fire. The speed of the towing had fanned the smouldering destruction. A blue gleam appeared forward, shining below the wreck of the deck. It wavered in patches. It seemed to stir and creep like the light of a glowworm. I saw it first, and told Marn. "Then the game's up," he said. "We had better stop this towing, or she will burst out suddenly fore and aft before we can clear out." We set up a yell, rang bells to attract their attention. They towed on. At last, Marn and I had to crawl forward and cut the rope with an axe. There was no time to cast off the lashings. Red tongues could be seen licking the wilderness of splinters under our feet as we made our way back to the poop. Of course, they very soon found out in the steamer that the rope was gone. She gave a loud blast of her whistle. Her lights were seen sweeping in a wide circle. She came up ranging close alongside and stopped. We were all in a tight group on the poop looking at her. Every man had saved a little bundle or a bag. Suddenly, a conical flame with a twisted top shot up forward and threw upon the Black Sea a circle of light, with the two vessels side by side and heaving gently in its centre. Captain Beard had been sitting on the grating still and mute for hours, but now he rose slowly and advanced in front of us to the mizzen shrouds. Captain Nash hailed, "Come along, look sharp. I have mail bags on board. I will take you and your boats to Singapore." "Thank you, no," said our skipper. "We must see the last of the ship." "I can't stand by any longer," shouted the other. "Mails, you know." "Aye, aye, we are all right." "Very well. I'll report you in Singapore. Goodbye." He waved his hand. Our men dropped their bundles quietly. The steamer moved ahead and, passing out of the circle of light, vanished at once from our sight, dazzled by the fire which burned fiercely. And then I knew that I would see the east first as commander of a small boat. I thought it fine, and the fidelity to the old ship was fine. We should see the last of her. Oh, the glamour of youth! Oh, the fire of it, more dazzling than the flames of the burning ship, throwing a magic light on the wide earth, leaping audaciously to the sky, presently to be quenched by time, more cruel, more pitiless, more bitter than the sea, and like the flames of the burning ship surrounded by an impenetrable night. The old man warned us in his gentle and inflexible way that it was part of our duty to save for the underwriters as much as we could of the ship's gear. According, we went to work aft, while she blazed forward to give us plenty of light. We lugged out a lot of rubbish. What didn't we save? An old barometer fixed with an absurd quantity of screws nearly cost me my life. A sudden rush of smoke came upon me, and I just got away in time. There were various stores, bolts of canvas, coils of rope. The poop looked like a marine bazaar, and the boats were lumbered to the gunwales. One would have thought the old man wanted to take as much as he could of his first command with him. He was very, very quiet, but off his balance evidently. Would you believe it? He wanted to take a length of old stream cable and a kedge anchor with him in the longboat. We said, "Aye, aye, sir," deferentially, and on the quiet let the thing slip overboard. The heavy medicine chest went that way, 2 bags of green coffee, tins of paint, fancy, paint, a whole lot of things. Then I was ordered with 2 hands into the boats to make a stowage and get them ready against the time it would be proper for us to leave the ship. We put everything straight, stepped the longboat's mast for our skipper, who was in charge of her, and I was not sorry to sit down for a moment. My face felt raw, every limb ached as if broken. I was aware of all my ribs, and would have sworn to a twist in the backbone. The boats, fast astern, lay in a deep shadow, and all around I could see the circle of the sea lighted by the fire. A gigantic flame arose forward straight and clear. It flared there, with noises like the whir of wings, with rumbles as of thunder. There were cracks, detonations, and from the cone of flame the sparks flew upwards, as man is born to trouble, to leaky ships, and to ships that burn. What bothered me was that the ship, lying broadside to the swell and to such wind as there was, a mere breath, the boats would not keep astern where they were safe, but persisted, in a pig-headed way boats have, in getting under the counter and then swinging alongside. They were knocking about dangerously and coming near the flame, while the ship rolled on them, and of course there was always the danger of the masts going over the side at any moment. I and my 2 boat-keepers kept them off as best we could with oars and boat-hooks, but to be constantly at it became exasperating, since there was no reason why we should not leave at once. We could not see those on board, nor could we imagine what caused the delay. The boat-keepers were swearing feebly, and I had not only my share of the work, but also had to keep at it 2 men who showed a constant inclination to lay themselves down and let things slide. At last I hailed on deck there, and someone looked over. "We're ready here," I said. The head disappeared, and very soon popped up again. The captain says, "All right, sir, and to keep the boats well clear of the ship." Half an hour passed. Suddenly there was a frightful racket, rattle, clanking of chain, hiss of water, and millions of sparks flew up into the shivering column of smoke that stood leaning slightly above the ship. The catheads had burned away, and the 2 red-hot anchors had gone to the bottom, tearing out after them 200 fathom of red-hot chain. The ship trembled, the mass of flame swayed as if ready to collapse, and the fore-top-gallant mast fell. It darted down like an arrow of fire, shot under, and instantly leaping up within an oar's length of the boats, floated quietly, very black on the luminous sea. I hailed the deck again. After some time, a man in an unexpectedly cheerful but also muffled tone, as though he had been trying to speak with his mouth shut, informed me, "Coming directly, sir," and vanished. For a long time I heard nothing but the whir and roar of the fire. There were also whistling sounds. The boats jumped, tugged at the painters, ran at each other playfully, knocked their sides together, or, do what we would, swung in a bunch against the ship's side. I couldn't stand it any longer, and swarming up a rope, clambered aboard over the stern. It was as bright as day. Coming up like this, the sheet of fire facing me was a terrifying sight, and the heat seemed hardly bearable at first. On a settee cushion dragged out of the cabin, Captain Beard, with his legs drawn up and one arm under his head, slept with the light playing on him. Do you know what the rest were busy about? They were sitting on deck right aft, round an open case, eating bread and cheese and drinking bottled stout. On the background of flames twisting in fierce tongues above their heads, they seemed at home like salamanders and looked like a band of desperate pirates. The fire sparkled in the whites of their eyes, gleamed on patches of white skin seen through the torn shirts. Each had the marks as of a battle about him. Bandaged heads, tied-up arms, a strip of dirty rag round a knee, and each man had a bottle between his legs and a chunk of cheese in his hand. Mahon got up, with his handsome and disreputable head, his hooked profile, his long white beard, and with an uncorked bottle in his hand. He resembled one of those reckless sea robbers of old, making merry amidst violence and disaster. "The last meal on board," he explained solemnly. "We had nothing to eat all day, and it was no use leaving all this." He flourished the bottle and indicated the sleeping skipper. "He said he couldn't swallow anything, so I got him to lie down," he went on. And as I stared, "I don't know whether you are aware, young fellow, the man had no sleep to speak of for days, and there will be damn little sleep in the boats." "There will be no boats by and by if you fool about much longer," I said indignantly. I walked up to the skipper and shook him by the shoulder. At last he opened his eyes, but did not move. "Time to leave her, sir," I said quietly. He got up painfully, looked at the flames, at the sea sparkling round the ship, and black as ink farther away. He looked at the stars shining dim through a thin veil of smoke in a sky black as Erebus. "Youngest first," he said. And the ordinary seaman, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, got up, clambered over the taffrail, and vanished. Others followed. One, on the point of going over, stopped short to drain his bottle, and with a great swing of his arm flung it at the fire. "Take this," he cried. The skipper lingered disconsolately, and we left him to commune alone for a while with his first command. Then I went up again and brought him away at last. It was time. The ironwork on the poop was hot to the touch. Then the painter of the longboat was cut, and the 3 boats, tied together, drifted clear of the ship. It was just 16 hours after the explosion when we abandoned her. Marn had charge of the second boat, and I had the smallest, the 14-foot thing. The longboat would have taken the lot of us, but the skipper said we must save as much property as we could for the underwriters, and so I got my first command. I had 2 men with me, a bag of biscuits, a few tins of meat, and a breaker of water. I was ordered to keep close to the longboat, that in case of bad weather we might be taken into her. And do you know what I thought? I thought I would part company as soon as I could. I wanted to have my first command all to myself. I wasn't going to sail in a squadron if there were a chance for independent cruising. I would make land by myself. I would beat the other boats. Youth! All youth! The silly, charming, beautiful youth. But we did not make a start at once. We must see the last of the ship. And so the boats drifted about that night, heaving and setting on the swell. The men dozed, waked, sighed, groaned. I looked at the burning ship. Between the darkness of earth and heaven she was burning fiercely upon a disk of purple sea, shot by the blood-red play of gleams, upon a disk of water glittering and sinister. A high, clear flame, an immense and lonely flame, ascended from the ocean, and from its summit the black smoke poured continuously at the sky. She burned furiously, mournful and imposing, like a funeral pile kindled in the night, surrounded by the sea, watched over by the stars. A magnificent death had come like a grace, like a gift, like a reward to that old ship at the end of her laborious days. The surrender of her weary ghost to the keeping of stars and sea was stirring like the sight of a glorious triumph. The masts fell just before daybreak, and for a moment there was a burst and turmoil of sparks that seemed to fill with flying fire the night patient and watchful, the vast night lying silent upon the sea. At daylight she was only a charred shell, floating still under a cloud of smoke and bearing a glowing mass of coal within. Then the oars were got out, and the boats forming in a line moved round her remains as if in procession, the longboat leading. As we pulled across her stern, a slim dart of fire shot out viciously at us, and suddenly she went down, head first, in a great hiss of steam. The unconsumed stern was the last to sink, but the paint had gone, had cracked, had peeled off, and there were no letters, there was no word, no stubborn device that was like her soul, to flash at the rising sun her creed and her name. We made our way north. A breeze sprang up, and about noon all the boats came together for the last time. I had no mast or sail in mine, but I made a mast out of a spare oar and hoisted a boat awning for a sail, with a boat hook for a yard. She was certainly overmasted, but I had the satisfaction of knowing that with the wind aft, I could beat the other two. I had to wait for them. Then we all had a look at the captain's chart, and after a sociable meal of hard bread and water, got our last instructions. These were simple: steer north and keep together as much as possible. "Be careful with that jury rig, Marlowe," said the captain, and Marn, as I sailed proudly past his boat, wrinkled his curved nose and hailed, "You will sail that ship of yours under water if you don't look out, young fellow." He was a malicious old man, and may the deep sea where he sleeps now rock him gently, rock him tenderly to the end of time. Before sunset, a thick rain squall passed over the two boats, which were far astern, and that was the last I saw of them for a time. Next day, I sat steering my cockleshell, my first command, with nothing but water and sky around me. I did sight in the afternoon the upper sails of a ship far away, but said nothing, and my men did not notice her. You see, I was afraid she might be homeward bound, and I had no mind to turn back from the portals of the east. I was steering for Java, another blessed name, like Bangkok, you know. I steered many days. Now, I need not tell you what it is to be knocking about in an open boat. I remember nights and days of calm when we pulled, and the boat seemed to stand still, as if bewitched within the circle of the sea horizon. I remember the heat, the deluge of rain squalls that kept us bailing for dear life but filled our water cask. And I remember 16 hours on end with a mouth dry as a cinder and a steering oar over the stern to keep my first command head onto a breaking sea. I did not know how good a man I was till then. I remember the drawn faces, the dejected figures of my two men, and I remember my youth and the feeling that will never come back any more, the feeling that I could last forever, outlast the sea, the earth, and all men, the deceitful feeling that lures us on to joys, to perils, to love, to vain effort, to death, the triumphant conviction of strength, the heat of life in the handful of dust, the glow in the heart that with every year grows dim, grows cold, grows small, and expires too soon before life itself. And this is how I see the East. I have seen its secret places and have looked into its very soul, but now I see it always from a small boat, a high outline of mountains, blue and afar in the morning, like faint mist at noon, a jagged wall of purple at sunset. I have the feel of the oar in my hand, the vision of a scorching blue sea in my eyes, and I see a bay, a wide bay, smooth as glass and polished like ice, shimmering in the dark. A red light burns far off upon the gloom of the land, and the night is soft and warm. We drag at the oars with aching arms, and suddenly a puff of wind, a puff faint and tepid and laden with strange odours of blossoms, of aromatic wood, comes out of the still night, the first sigh of the east on my face, that I can never forget. It was impalpable and enslaving, like a charm, like a whispered promise of mysterious delight. We had been pulling this finishing spell for 11 hours. 2 pulled, and he whose turn it was to rest sat at the tiller. We had made out the red light in that bay and steered for it, guessing it must mark some small coasting port. We passed 2 vessels, outlandish and high-sterned, sleeping at anchor, and approaching the light, now very dim, ran the boat's nose against the end of a jutting wharf. We were blind with fatigue. My men dropped the oars and fell off the thwarts as if dead. I made fast to a pile. A current rippled softly. The scented obscurity of the shore was grouped into vast masses, a density of colossal clumps of vegetation, probably, mute and fantastic shapes. And at their foot, the semicircle of a beach gleamed faintly, like an illusion. There was not a light, not a stir, not a sound. The mysterious east faced me, perfumed like a flower, silent like death, dark like a grave. And I sat weary beyond expression, exulting like a conqueror, sleepless and entranced as if before a profound, a fateful enigma. A splashing of oars, a measured dip reverberating on the level of water, intensified by the silence of the shore into loud claps, made me jump up. A boat, a European boat, was coming in. I invoked the name of the dead. I hailed, "Judea, ahoy!" A thin shout answered. It was the captain. I had beaten the flagship by 3 hours, and I was glad to hear the old man's voice, tremulous and tired. "Is it you, Marlowe?" "Mind the end of that jetty, sir," I cried. He approached cautiously and brought up with the deep-sea lead line which we had saved, for the underwriters. I eased my painter and fell alongside. He sat, a broken figure at the stern, wet with dew, his hands clasped in his lap. His men were asleep already. "I had a terrible time of it," he murmured. "Marne is behind, not very far." We conversed in whispers, in low whispers, as if afraid to wake up the land. Guns, thunder, earthquakes would not have awakened the men just then. Looking around as we talked, I saw away at sea a bright light travelling in the night. "There's a steamer passing the bay," I said. "She was not passing, she was entering, and she even came close and anchored." "I wish," said the old man, "you would find out whether she is English. Perhaps they could give us a passage somewhere." He seemed nervously anxious. So by dint of punching and kicking, I started one of my men into a state of somnambulism, and giving him an oar, took another and pulled towards the lights of the steamer. There was a murmur of voices in her, metallic hollow clangs of the engine room, footsteps on the deck. Her ports shone, round like dilated eyes. Shapes moved about, and there was a shadowy man high up on the bridge. He heard my oars. And then, before I could open my lips, the East spoke to me, but it was in a Western voice. A torrent of words was poured into the enigmatical, the fateful silence. Outlandish, angry words, mixed with words and even whole sentences of good English, less strange, but even more surprising. The voice swore and cursed violently. It riddled the solemn peace of the bay by a volley of abuse. It began by calling me pig, and from that went crescendo into unmentionable adjectives, in English. The man up there raged aloud in 2 languages, and with a sincerity in his fury that almost convinced me I had, in some way, sinned against the harmony of the universe. I could hardly see him, but began to think he would work himself into a fit. Suddenly he ceased, and I could hear him snorting and blowing like a porpoise. I said, "What steamer is this, pray?" "Eh? What's this? And who are you?" "Castaway crew of an English bark burnt at sea. We came here tonight. I am the second mate. The captain is in the longboat, and wishes to know if you would give us a passage somewhere." "Oh my goodness!" I say. "This is the Celestial from Singapore on her return trip. I'll arrange with your captain in the morning. And," I say, "did you hear me just now? I should think the whole bay heard you. I thought you were a shore boat. Now look here. This infernal, lazy scoundrel of a caretaker has gone to sleep again. Curse him. The light is out, and I nearly ran foul of the end of this damned jetty. This is the 3rd time he plays me this trick. Now I ask you, can anybody stand this kind of thing? It's enough to drive a man out of his mind. I'll report him. I'll get the assistant resident to give him the sack by— See, there's no light. It's out, isn't it? I take you to witness the lights out. There should be a light, you know. A red light on the—" "There was a light," I said mildly. "But it's out, man. What's the use of talking like this? You can see for yourself it's out, don't you? If you had to take a valuable steamer along this godforsaken coast, you would want a light too. I'll kick him from end to end of his miserable wharf. You'll see if I don't. I will." "So I may tell my captain you'll take us?" I broke in. "Yes, I'll take you. Good night," he said brusquely. I pulled back, made fast again to the jetty, and then went to sleep at last. I had faced the silence of the East. I had heard some of its languages, but when I opened my eyes again, the silence was as complete as though it had never been broken. I was lying in a flood of light, and the sky had never looked so far, so high before. I opened my eyes and lay without moving. And then I saw the men of the East. They were looking at me. The whole length of the jetty was full of people. I saw brown, bronze, yellow faces, the black eyes, the glitter, the colour of an Eastern crowd, and all these beings stared without a murmur, without a sigh, without a movement. They stared down at the boats, at the sleeping men who at night had come to them from the sea. Nothing moved. The fronds of palms stood still against the sky. Not a branch stirred along the shore, and the brown roofs of hidden houses peeped through the green foliage, through the big leaves that hung shining and still like leaves forged of heavy metal. This was the East of the ancient navigators, so old, so mysterious, resplendent and sombre, living and unchanged, full of danger and promise. And these were the men. I sat up suddenly. A wave of movement passed through the crowd from end to end, passed along the heads, swayed the bodies, ran along the jetty like a ripple on the water, like a breath of wind on a field, and all was still again. I see it now, the wide sweep of the bay, the glittering sands, the wealth of green infinite and varied, the sea blue like the sea of a dream, the crowd of attentive faces, the blaze of vivid colour, the water reflecting it all, the curve of the shore, the jetty, the high-sterned outlandish craft floating still, and the 3 boats with tired men from the west, sleeping unconscious of the land, and the people, and of the violence of sunshine. They slept thrown across the thwarts, curled on bottom boards, in the careless attitudes of death. The head of the old skipper, leaning back in the stern of the longboat, had fallen on his breast, and he looked as though he would never wake. Farther out, old Mahan's face was upturned to the sky, with the long white beard spread out on his breast, as though he had been shot where he sat at the tiller. And a man, all in a heap in the bows of the boat, slept with both arms embracing the stemhead, and with his cheek laid on the gunwale. The East looked at them without a sound. I have known its fascination since. I have seen the mysterious shores, the still water, the lands of brown nations, where a stealthy nemesis lies in wait, pursues, overtakes so many of the conquering race, who are proud of their wisdom, of their knowledge, of their strength. But for me, all the East is contained in that vision of my youth. It is all in that moment when I opened my young eyes on it. I came upon it from a tussle with the sea, and I was young, and I saw it looking at me. And this is all that is left of it. Only a moment of strength, of romance, of glamour, of youth. A flick of sunshine upon a strange shore, the time to remember, the time for a sigh, and goodbye, night, goodbye. He drank. Ah, the good old time, the good old time. Youth and the sea, glamour and the sea, the good, strong sea, the salt, bitter sea that could whisper to you and roar at you and knock your breath out of you. He drank again. By all that's wonderful, it is the sea, I believe, the sea itself, or is it youth alone? Who can tell? But you here, you all had something out of life, money, love, whatever one gets on shore, and tell me, wasn't that the best time? That time when we were young at sea, young and had nothing, on the sea that gives nothing, except hard knocks, and sometimes a chance to feel your strength, that only, what you all regret. And we all nodded at him. The man of finance, the man of accounts, the man of law, we all nodded at him over the polished table that like a still sheet of brown water reflected our faces, lined, wrinkled, our faces marked by toil, by deceptions, by success, by love. Our weary eyes looking still, looking always, looking anxiously for something out of life that while it is expected is already gone, has passed unseen, in a sigh, in a flash, together with the youth, with the strength, with the romance of illusions.